Let's say that you are a Saudi Arabian citizen and you know, you're coming from an area that has a lot of terrorism. You're applying for a temporary visa to the United...
Do the green card example. Don't be a little bitch. Don't be a bitch. Do the green card example. Stop trying to do it on the temporary visas, on applications. Do the green card example.
No, I won't.
Don't be a fucking bitch.
No, I won't. And I'll tell you exactly why, because we can go ahead and differentiate these scenarios. Can't we?
No,
Pisco.
don't be a bitch.
We can use our reason in order to differentiate.
Everyone can see what you're doing.
No, we'll go to the green card.
Everyone can see what you're doing. Just do the green card. Just do the green card.
No.
Take the harder case for your position.
Nope, I'm going to walk you. Nope, I listen to you for minutes at a time. You're going to listen to me for minutes at a time.
You're such a weasel. Hey, folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description.
So, yeah, good morning to everyone on my home channel. Good morning to everybody on Pisco's channel. My name is Connor. I'm a science fiction, political, and philosophy nerd, a Marine Corps and law enforcement veteran. My primary channel is Counterpoints 40K, where I break down the wonderful world of Warhammer. But I also recently went full-time streaming on a YouTube media network called Valor Media Network. I'm streaming 25 hours a week with them and, you know, cutting up segments and posting content there. Valor is actually an offshoot of Midas Touch, but it's first responder and veterans focused. So we're trying to build up the channel. Obviously, it's very small right now, but we're excited and we believe in the project. So hopefully in the next 6 months, we'll explode and then we'll all be making stupid amounts of money and creating fire content and entertaining the masses while also calling out all of the BS in our society that is ripping us apart right now.
Appreciate that introduction, Connor. Before we get started, there's a very important question from Josiah from Pondering Politics. Says, how badly do you think His Imperial Majesty Sheev Palpatine would curb stop the God Emperor of Man?
So he's asked me this multiple times and my answer is never going to change. Sheev Palpatine would be a delicious morning snack for the God Emperor of mankind. He's not even that powerful in the Warhammer 40K universe. He's like an alpha level psyker, which is obviously powerful, but being able to
run
control
all of the galaxies like interstellar space. See, I learned something.
Sorry, what's that? What was the question?
Doesn't he run all of interstellar travel? The God Emperor of Man?
Yeah, he's literally he has a psychic beacon that shoots out into the galaxy, and that is what allows spaceships to travel. So, and that's just like him sitting there. Like he's not even, you know, he's not even doing anything. He's just sitting in a chair, and he's a giant, bright lighthouse through which the galaxy operates.
No, that's so nerdy. But we had a conversation about your start in the Warcraft. Is it Warcraft? Warhammer, my bad. I'm just trying to piss you off. No,
it's all good.
I appreciate the questions. I appreciate everything, and I appreciate your introduction. Connor.
Sure.
You and I, would you say we're friends?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like if you say you're my friend, then I'm your friend.
I think I would. But you pissed me the off.
Same.
Yeah. And I want to have this conversation with you because I do think that there are a lot of things that I am very happy with you about. I'm very happy that you're loyal to the country. You know, not a lot of conservatives these days who are prominent kind of, you know, influencer conservative types, I feel are loyal to the country. And I feel ultimately you stood on business. You voted for someone who, in many instances, we fought about Kamala Harris. For example, her position on guns, and it took a lot from you policy-wise, I think, to pull the trigger and A, not vote for Donald Trump, and B, vote for Kamala Harris instead. Or sorry, I should say not vote for the Republican candidate and actually take the decision to vote for Kamala Harris as opposed to just sitting it out. And so I respect you a lot for that. But then there are these like little issues that will come up where I'm like, this guy's a fucking fascist. And I want to hash it out with him. So, but that's kind of and it has to do with immigration. But I see you in one breath being very based on immigration, then I see another breath being very cringe on immigration, and that's kind of why I want to talk to you. But I'll give you an opportunity to
meditate. I can articulate the difference, and if you'll indulge me. Mm-hmm. So I don't use. I'm just going to say it now because it is a element of emotional catharsis, but my emotional catharsis is coming from something terrible, right? That it sucks. So I feel like I knew that I was advocating for the lesser of two evils in the past election. I took a lot of flack from a lot of people Rob Noor, Admiral Gibbs, a whole bunch of other Republicans, lactoid, libertarians, and centrist and moderate and authoritarian Republicans, except for Jeb Tan, believe it or not. That was the only person that didn't give me a bunch of flack for leaning Democrat this election. And, I really wish that I was wrong. I wish that Trump wasn't. I wish that I had been alarmist. I wish that I had been wrong about Trump being a massive anti-constitutional piece of shit who was going to use his wealth, power, and influence and nepotism in order to corrupt and degrade our country. And yet I was right. And so now I'm experiencing simultaneously like catharsis because I feel like I made the right choice. And I'm also experiencing a healthy chunk of like anger and sadness because he's worse than I thought he would be. So that's where I'm at these days. Can I give you like a fascist prelude because I think it's going to be important. So fascism, I've read Benito Mussolini, I've read Adolf Hitler, I've talked with who is it, like Keith Woods, Cultured Thug, and Curtis Yarvin. I feel like I'm pretty familiar with fascism.
Wait, you've talked to Curtis Yarvin?
What's that?
You've talked to Curtis Yarvin?
Yeah.
Like the Curtis Yarvin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I feel like I have a pretty firm hold on it. And it's flexible authoritarianism and political corporatism. Political corporatism is treating the nation state like a body. And then flexible authoritarianism is effectively power for its own power's sake. I don't believe in power for its own sake. So that's where you and I are butting heads, is you're like, oh, you have these like random fascist impulses. And I feel like I have random nationalist impulses. But you need to understand, I ultimately am a Republican. I ultimately am conservative in a lot of ways. So just because there's these flare-ups of like random conservative bullshit doesn't mean, it just means I disagree with you on principle. And we can analyze those principles.
I mean, I take fascism to be something akin to an ultra-nationalist, ultra-conservative form of authoritarianism that's characterized by like a lot of different things. And I'm not married right now to that terminology or applying it, semantically to whatever going on. I kind of say it tongue-in-cheek to I'm just a sense of authoritarianism that I'm getting from you, or a lack of consideration or proper due deference to certain rights. And so when I say, I see some fascist tendencies, I'm not prepared at the moment to have a debate about whether or not you are a fascist.
You could say authoritarian or nationalist tendencies, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
What I would hit you back with, though, since you're being tongue-in-cheek, I'll be tongue-in-cheek real quick. There's a clip from the movie, Full Metal Jacket, where a general is dressing down like a Lance Corporal, because the Lance Corporal is wearing a peace button on his uniform as he's fighting the Vietnam War. And the general says, he uses a racial slur, but he says, inside every Vietnamese person, there is an American crawling to get out. And that's where my nationalism might be a little bit different, because I do think that everyone has the capacity of being an American, but that means adopting a certain set of values. And in reference to this conversation, advocacy for terrorism is not one of them.
Yeah, 100%. I see where you're coming from, and I kind of want to triangulate, to use a phrase, our differences, or let's see where we agree. Let's see where we just start to disagree. Okay.
Sure.
I think you and I agree with respect to immigration that there ought to be basic levels of due process. So the reason I think this is, I see your tweets condemning, for example, the immediate deportation of alleged alien enemies to El Salvador, or wrongfully deported people to El Salvador, or people who are, not given opportunities to contest certain findings. And so I very much see you, I don't think we have an issue that people who are detained and people who are subject to the immigration law of the United States should be given minimum standards of due process. And what's more, I think there's an even more fundamental point here is, whatever the law is on immigration should be followed. That is to say, we should not have, it's 2 points. They're kind of related. One is, the government should at all times follow the law with respect to immigration, and the government should provide minimum standards of due process under the law or the Constitution to aliens that are subject to immigration law.
Yeah, we are in complete alignment, and not to tangent, but I find the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia particularly nefarious, where I view this as like a litmus test for our republic, where if our Congress members and our courts don't stand up to the Trump administration, we're effectively inviting authoritarian disaster in our country.
Okay, that's great. I think we agree on that. I think we agree on Kilmar. I think we agree that what's going on with I don't know if you saw the Bukele whatever interaction.
I had a modicum of respect for Bukele prior to this, probably because I was buying into the authoritarian nationalist propaganda.
Yeah.
But after this, that mirage is shattered. If you'll indulge me a moment. So El Salvador had one of the worst homicide rates in the world. I think in a certain year, it was like around 103 per 100,000, which is effectively like, I don't know, it's 20 times the American rate. And it was like worse than Iraq had ever been during the civil war in Iraq that we kicked off through the invasion of Iraq. So what Bukele did was he effectively instituted an authoritarian rule where if you had any gang affiliations whatsoever, a whiff of gang activity, including tattoos, but also not just tattoos, you were detained inside a jail and you were held for prolonged periods of time with very minimal due process. Now, as a result, the homicide rate dropped down to 2 per 100,000. And so this was a widely popular move. And 2 per 100,000 is effectively the same homicide rate as Western European countries. So we went from one of the worst countries on the planet from a homicide perspective to competing with developed nations. So that was kind of like, I don't know, a heartwarming story about reduced murders and anarchy inside a crazy failed state inside Central America. However, what he's done in the meantime with the Trump admin is with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he was accused of being a gang member of MS-13 in 2019 off of 2 pieces of information. One of them was wearing a black Chicago Bulls hat while he was looking for day labor outside of Home Depot. The second piece of information was a testimony from a confidential informant who said that he was a member of MS-13 from New York. There's a couple of problems with this. Number one, Kilmar Abrego Garcia has been here since 2011. He hasn't committed a crime. To my knowledge, he doesn't have any gang-affiliated tattoos. Also, he's been participating in the community, and during the accusations of deportation and criminal activity and all that kind of stuff, him and his lawyers, his lawyers and they presented substantive evidence that he was effectively a normie. He had a wife, he had a kid, he was gainfully employed, he was a member of the community, he was working his butt off, he was trying to achieve the American dream. And so what we have Bukele do, I'm sorry it took me a while to get here, but what Bukele did when he was asked about Kilmar in particular is he said, why would I deport a terrorist back to the United States? And so he's effectively giving the Trump admin carte blanche to send him anyone, and regardless of their innocence or guilt, he will hold on to them as long as he doesn't receive sufficient domestic pressure to release that person.
I want to.
It's evil.
Yeah, I want to bolster 2 things that you said. First, on Kilmar specifically, it's everything you say there is true, and it's even worse than that because if you take the administration at its word that based on this evidence he's a quote prominent member of MS-13. Why did the administration release him back into the country in 2019, right? He was granted withholding of removal in 2019. These are immigration judges. They're under the Department of Justice. They could have appealed the ruling of granting of withholding. And so what's the sense if it's true, right? And the only evidence we have is based on these hearsay allegations and tenuous assumptions that have never truly been tested in a real adversarial proceeding. What we're talking about here, the determinations by the judge, this is like a bond hearing, the equivalent of a bond hearing where the court's actually pretty limited in paying deference to these reports, which by the way were internally self-contradictory. We're saying wrong things. We're saying he was picked up for the wrong thing. So if it's all true, right? If that's such strong evidence that he's a prominent member of MS-13, why did the administration release him into the country in 2019? And to your point,
if they had evidence, they would have presented it in public by now. This story would have been 24 hours. This would have been a 24 hours news cycle if they had the evidence. And what I mean by that is there would have been an online furor over, you're deporting a Maryland man who has 3 autistic children. What the hell? And then the Trump admin could have shown us, they could have been like, look, he has all these tattoos. He, was credibly accused of homicide and drug activity at this time, and this time. He was just never convicted. Therefore, he is a member of MS-13. And you know what would have happened? I would have shut up. I would have stopped talking about it. I would have been like, okay, it seems like there's smoke.
No, I hear you, and I agree with your assessment that that's what the news story would have been. But what we're talking about here is gang affiliations.
But they don't have that.
I understand they don't have it, and I agree that that's what the news would have been, and that's how the cycle would have been. But it almost doesn't matter, right? For purposes of our authoritarian analysis, it almost doesn't matter whether he even is actually a former or current member of MS-13. The authoritarian aspect of this is the fact that he was not given due process, is the fact that he was granted withholding, and that he was removed. Regardless of whether or not he is actually a member or a criminal or anything like that, the government should have to jump through hoops to deport him on that basis or to remove his withholding. And so I agree with you that it's helpful for the case that he doesn't appear to be credibly accused of being a gang member, but I almost think it doesn't matter. That's one thing, but I do appreciate that
the facts. I still concede on the due process grounds. What actually pisses me off to no end that I had to withstand and by the way, I'm happy to do it. If people want to rake me over the coals for my bad opinions or whatever, I don't care. Ultimately, that's the game that we're in. However, I do find it extremely frustrating that people Rob can articulate better than Admiral Gibbs, but people like Admiral Gibbs who can't even articulate basic philosophical concepts around politics were raking me over the coals for being insufficiently loyal to the Republican Party when I feel like this was kind of a foregone conclusion that shit like this was going to happen. And what's even more gross is that I like this guy, Phil Labonte, but he tried to argue with me a year ago that there were going to be adults in the room, so to speak, that would check Trump's authoritarian impulses as there were in the first administration. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing people like Stephen Miller and Pam Bondi. I think that Steve Miller is the head, whatever. He's the head of the cabinet or head of the whatever at the White House. I forget his exact title.
He's deputy chief of staff or chief of staff or something like that. I think deputy maybe.
Chief of staff. So we have his chief of staff.
So his chief of staff is Susan Wiles. Is it Wiles? I forget her name. It's her.
We could just Google it real quick. But the point is that he's a prominent member of the Trump cabinet.
I think he might be
What
deputy.
is Steve Miller's title right now? But then Pam Bondi, who's the Attorney General of the United States, immigration deputy,
chief of staff, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that's a major position.
White House Deputy Chief of Staff.
Yeah, that's a major position. That's so if you guys watch West Wing, that's the role that the main character's in. Oh my God, I don't even know his actor. I don't know. The main guy is a Deputy Chief of Staff.
So the point is that he's a prominent member of the Trump admin. And then not just that, we have the Attorney General of the United States, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, knowingly lying on national television about the Abrego Garcia case so that the Republican media can sanitize I'm just going to say it, the up that they did, and then also excuse the dystopian authoritarian bullshit that the Trump admin is up to. And so we have this confluence, and this is where I would agree with fascist, by the way. I don't think I'm a fascist, but this is where I would agree with fascist. Fascists don't care about the truth. They care about power and they care about consequence. So it doesn't matter that they're lying about due process. It doesn't matter that they're lying about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. It doesn't matter that they're using the media to launder their reputations. It doesn't matter that they're using the most powerful offices of the United States in order to achieve a nefarious result. All that matters is that they gain and maintain power. And so I do view Pam Bondi and Steve Miller as either fascist or fascist enabling.
100%. And so that was one point I wanted to underscore is the kind of tenuous allegations of his gang affiliation here, which I think don't resolve the issue, but they're important to look at as window dressing for examining the media's response, and also, as you mentioned, to see the lies that the administration is perpetuating in this case and in other immigration situations. So that's number one. The other point I wanted to bolster from your perspective is the gang problem in El Salvador. I've had clients from El Salvador. In fact, I have one specific client who they were trying to groom and they were trying to recruit, and whose story is harrowing with respect to the gang situation in El Salvador. I'll leave it there, other than to say, for me, it hits close to home, not because I'm from El Salvador, but I have spoken with people who have dealt with the gang violence in El Salvador and what it used to be. and it was absolutely unlivable in El Salvador.
I want to tell you one more effed up thing before we perhaps get into where we disagree. So think about this. The reason why the Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was held from being deported to El Salvador was because the judge believed that there was credible threats against his life from the 18th Street Gang. Okay. And one of the arguments that I heard from the Trump admin that was so laughably evil that I couldn't even believe it was they were saying, well, El Salvador solved the gang problem, so there actually should be no issues with him returning to El Salvador. But they didn't return Mr. Abrego Garcia to the streets of El Salvador to live a normal life where the homicide rate is 2 per 100,000. They returned him to the place in which they incarcerated all the other gang members. So they put him into the most dangerous situation possible for his situation. And so that's like just another like
even assuming
evil
he's a gang member, right?
Cake.
Even assuming he's a gang member, and even his withholding was based on threats of violence anyway. And so I guess even if he is not a gang member, he was put in the most dangerous place.
They put him in the most dangerous place possible for his condition based off of the stay order. And so they effectively said, because he's not one of us, he's not an American citizen, we don't care whether or not he lives or dies. And that's actually my sincere belief. They genuinely, they do not see him as a human being who is living, who is breathing, who is eating, who has family, who contributes to his community. They don't see him as a human being. They see him as an exterior member of a different tribe, and therefore it doesn't matter if he lives or dies. And I just think that's like, it's unadulterated evil. It's actually just evil.
And I'm actually concerned for his life. I don't know that I believe the administration when they
the Maryland senator is allegedly going to go see him on Wednesday to confirm that he's still alive.
I think that's based. And I don't know what we should do if it turns out that he either was murdered by Bukele or by a gang member. I don't know what we should do. I mean, that situation would be.
I think we should start banging the drums. I don't even care if the I get that it can be politically inconvenient to start banging the drums this early out from midterms or whatever, but genuinely, I would introduce articles of impeachment from.
I would already do that. Yeah. I would already do that.
Yeah.
But the House
you might burn out political momentum by the time you're actually able to effectuate them. But the truth is that this is so egregious that if you don't put on the record like this shit is evil, then I basically think that you've lost the moral plot.
Okay, so that's there, right? And I see you speaking with pretty like one-to-one morality or clarity, what I would see as the right position on this issue, and the right amount of like skepticism and contempt for the administration. So you seem to be well informed about the facts here, and I take that, right? And your skepticism.
How do we square this circle with Mahmoud Khalil?
but not. I just want to paint you a picture, right? So
sure,
we have not just the rescinding or purported rescinding of a green card of Mahmoud Khalil. It's a broader situation than that. The administration is systematically going after green card holders. They're searching social media feeds of both applicants and current holders of any kind of immigration benefit. There's a guy recently, I'm forgetting his name now, but I think yesterday or the day before, who was like about to do his naturalization process, who they picked up. There's been
snatched up in his interview.
There's a report that one of the people they picked up, one of the women who they alleged to be pro-Hamas or something, they had an internal State Department memo that said that she was not, like their own sycophants were saying not anti-Semitic, not all that shit. And okay, so we already have bad faith there. I guess what we will be arguing is, in the abstract, assuming we had a good faith administration to enforce this kind of shit, what would the reaction be? And I guess maybe we can start there. But I'm kind of
well, we can
go for it.
We can even assume bad faith.
All right.
So for instance, like my lines don't change. If you look, I'll try not to go too broad with it, but if you look at American history, we have always been imperfect executors of the ideals of our society. Like there are plenty of examples of even good presidents who have done. Look at Japanese internment. Look at the suspension of habeas corpus, which I do think is justifiable in the Civil War, but still is scary, right?
Sure.
There's plenty of times that look at slavery. There's plenty of times that we imperfectly fulfilled the ideals of our nation. And so imperfectly fulfilling the ideas of our nation is not enough for me to divide politics into a binary where I don't call balls and strikes. And so this is where, with Mahmoud Khalil specifically, you can say like, oh, the admin's a bad actor. Okay. that doesn't
so
change the facts of the case for, or
so
the
let's
facts of the matter
examine
for
it.
this case, in my opinion.
Let's examine it. So, I guess let's start with the basic premises here, which are, I think we agree that we can't analyze his non-speech related conduct because there are no allegations, and I'm assuming no factual predicate for the notion that he was involved in any criminal activity or occupation of buildings or encouraging of that. It may be true.
Why are you saying there's no facts of that? He's a member of a student organization that explicitly does that.
Well, wait a second. Of him specifically, right? That he specifically engaged in criminal conduct. You think that there are facts that substantiate his participation in criminal conduct?
Yeah, I think the fact that he is a member of CUAD and he's effectively a leader of CUAD and he negotiated on behalf of the student organization in order to like secure the release of the building shows that he's a member of that activity 100%.
So you think mere membership in CUAD is or should be a crime?
No.
Okay, so then I ask again, is there any factual predicate for the notion that he committed a crime?
No.
Okay, so then we agree that we cannot premise a removal argument or a deportation argument on any alleged criminal activity because really the only thing that matters is
criminal activity.
There are I agree. That's what I'm starting on things we agree with to try to narrow it because I don't want to hear later on.
Sure.
And hopefully we won't get too fiery. I think we started off good. I don't want to hear later on. Oh, but he occupied buildings. Oh, but they occupied buildings.
I don't know that.
With respect to the criminal activity aspect to it. Now, there could be other conduct-related stuff that he's involved with that make him deportable for other reasons. And just to be clear for everybody, there are things that make you deportable or inadmissible. Here, the basis of deportability would apply to him, but some map on to the basis of inadmissibility. There's categories of criminal bases of inadmissibility to deportability. Now, my argument is, we have to assess what the government actually provided in their notice to appear, their charging document. But even separate and apart from that, you can argue he should be deported on some other basis. But there is no facts in the record, I think, that would qualify him for being deportable on the basis of criminal conduct. I think we can agree on that.
Yep.
Okay. And so the next question is there a basis of removability or deportability? And what actually is the basis of removal or deportability? After we can do that first, or we can do the First Amendment argument. What do you want to do first?
Yeah, no, I can line up my argument, and you can try to knock it down.
Okay.
So it's fairly straightforward. And by the way, like this, I understand that you're saying that like the state isn't making the same arguments that I'm making. These are the arguments that I would make. And if a judge ruled one way or the other, then I would just be like, okay, but this is what I principally believe. Okay. This is what I believe conceptually. So Mahmoud Khalil was a member of a student organization named CUAD. Some people they talk about different levels of leadership and participation or whatever, but it's pretty much admitted that he negotiated on behalf of CUAD's behalf in order to work with the administration of Columbia University to secure the release of buildings after they had been occupied. And I don't care about peaceful protests, whatever. There's a bunch of hippies in universities that protest all the time. That's not my problem. My problem is that with CUAD in particular, I'm actually going to pull it up on my screen. They were active as recently as March 7th. So this is a active Substack that is a part of the organization. And October 17, 2024, they commemorated the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attacks. And they celebrate the martyrs. So they're talking about the people, not just civilians. They're also talking about members of the Al-Qassam Brigades, which is the militant wing of Hamas, who got killed by IDF. They talk about how they convinced former students, or not former students, they convinced students who were at first repulsed by the viciousness of the Hamas attacks that actually, in the operations to secure a free Palestine, it's actually not that big of a deal. They talk about student occupations of buildings in Brazil, in which they're analyzing the tactics of those student organizations in order to enhance their own organization's capacity to occupy buildings. And then they also talk about resistance to the Israeli occupation forces, in which they glorify the Al-Qassam brigades by name. So they're effectively sweeping for the October 7, 2023 terrorist attacks, and they're glorifying and minimizing the crimes of a designated terrorist organization.
Okay, so the first assumption that I want to press you on is...
Are you still with me? Did I lose you?
Can you hear me? Testing 1 2 3.
Yeah, I lost you for a second, but I came back.
Okay, the first assumption that I want to press on there is the notion that the statement of an organization should be applied to each one of its...
Did you hear all of it?
Yes, I heard everything you said.
Okay.
Yep. First is that, do you believe that the statement of an organization... Now, I don't believe he's alleged to be a member of this organization, right?
I mean, he is.
Well, he's not a formal member, right?
I have no idea how the organization... I have no idea the formal organization of the CUAD.
Do you know whether he's a formal member or not?
If you're willing to negotiate on behalf of the organization for a student sit-in, I would say that you're probably a member.
Whoa, that's an assumption, isn't it? He could not be a member, right? He could be negotiating because he...
Okay, so hold on. So let's just run it as a hypothetical. You're saying that if University of Central Florida is up the block, okay?
Okay.
Let's say that I have the Students for Israel organization, and we're like, genocide is awesome. It's the coolest thing ever. And we want America to support Israel and its genocide of Palestinians even harder.
Yep.
And then I go, and not only am I like hanging out with all the people who are a member of the organization, but then I negotiate on their behalf the release of buildings by the pro-Israeli genocidal people. You're saying like, oh, well...
No, I'm just asking a question. Is it actually confirmed? Can you confirm that he is a formal member of this organization?
I can't personally.
Okay. So is it fair in your mind, we'll get to the First Amendment argument, that he should be held responsible for statements he hasn't made from an organization he is not a member of, merely because he facilitated and was part of the negotiation? He should be held to account.
I don't agree. Yeah, I'm going to substantiate what I said. So what you're asking me is something that I don't think I can prove. So CUAD, to my knowledge, doesn't have like little placards that they print out with like name badges that they hand out to all the students that are a part of and verify their identification. However, there is, not only did he negotiate on their behalf with the administration, this isn't contested. Not only did he kind of like identify, quote unquote, self-identify as like a leader of the CUAD, but the movement is broader than the CUAD,
right? The movement is broader than the CUAD,
then
right?
There's videos of him hanging out with other student protesters and doing interviews along with CUAD, people.
Wait, is it
that's
possible?
Sufficient.
Is it possible for him to be a leader of the Palestinian protests and be doing everything you talked about without believing what the CUAD believes and without being a member of the CUAD? Certainly, you would agree.
Why would you participate? You're kind of like stretching the limits of credibility for me, or like logic.
Really?
Why would you negotiate? Why would you negotiate on behalf of a student organization that you are not a part of? Why would you also effectively say everything that they were saying minus the Hamas glorification? Why would you say that publicly?
Maybe because you don't believe. Wait, maybe because you don't believe it. Maybe because you don't subscribe to it. Wait, so he could have been, for example, a negotiator for other reasons, right? Maybe he agrees with some of the students on some things. Maybe they have common cause with respect to...
Then he can articulate that in court. But that's...
Wait a second. No. What we're talking about right now is just merely whether or not you can ascribe to him the statements of people who are not him on an organization that you say yourself you can't admit that he's actually a member of. Is that something that you
if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, I'm going to call it a duck.
Wait. So
hell yeah. You think that if I show up to a fucking protest about like pro-life shit or excuse me, pro-choice shit, and then I'm a part of it and I got a placard and I'm like, hey, hands off my uterus. Blah, 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 blah.
Bro.
You can't categorize me as like a pro person. And then if I negotiate on behalf of a specific organization with the student body, a school of which I am a former alumni, You're saying that you can't safely assume that you're a member of the student organization?
So I think
he's just a concerned citizen?
So I think you're being more narrow and more broad in different locations where it suits you, and I think it's not fair. So on the one hand, I think you're saying that he was negotiating on behalf of CUAD, when I think the negotiations were on behalf of the protesters. And I think that you would agree the protesters are not coextensive with CUAD. Yes or no?
CUAD is running the protests and the building occupations. So they're either CUAD or they're supporters of CUAD.
Okay, but are they coextensive? Are the members, people who are a member of this organization, are they the same set as the people who are protesters, occupiers? They're different sets, right? There could be more radical factions among the people who are occupying, more radical factions among the people who are...
So how about I just read you what is publicly available so we're not guessing at it, I guess.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. This is Wikipedia. Obviously, take it with a grain of salt, but this is what's publicly available in a summary format. Mm-hmm. Following the start of the Gazan war in 2023, Khalil became involved in pro-Palestinian activism. He served as a negotiator and spokesperson for students associated with the Columbia University Apartheid Divest in discussions with Columbia University officials and was often seen unmasked on the front lines of protests. Khalil said, as a Palestinian student, do you want me to stop?
Well, there, the language, I think, is much different, right? The language is he is negotiating on behalf of students affiliated with CUAD, not as an official CUAD negotiator. And I don't think that that's fairly, for example, and I want to try to link this to I want to try to link it to your experience. Someone might say, hey, look at all these libs in this lib area. We might pick counterpoints to negotiate with the right-wingers, right? Let's say that you even agree with the right-wingers on something. Let's say that you're at a protest where you're agreeing with the right-wingers on something or the Trump supporters on something. We might go to you, let's say if the MAGA people start to get in trouble and do the wrong thing, or for whatever reason, we might come to you and you might say, listen, I don't agree with them and everything, but I'm happy to facilitate negotiations. All I'm trying to say is, and we haven't even reached the main argument, I don't think it's fair that you attribute to an individual, Mahmoud Khalil, and make him be punished for the statements of an organization where you can't prove that he authorized the statements, you can't prove that he knew about the statements. He might not know about the statements, right? So you need to make a connection there.
Let's read the whole thing because I think there's evidence that cuts both ways. So I would rather read the evidence and then we can fight about the evidence. So and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, and one paragraph is only one sentence, and I can read. I can read quickly.
Read it all.
Okay. Khalil said, as a Palestinian student, I believe that the liberation of the Palestinian people and the Jewish people are intertwined and go hand in hand, and you cannot achieve one without the other. He said CUAD supported social justice and freedom and equality for everyone. At the time, Khalil was on a student visa that required full-time enrollment. He said he avoided high-risk protests and communicated with the university to ensure he would not create trouble, as any suspension would jeopardize his student visa. On April 30th, 2024, he received an email from Columbia suspending him from alleged participation in the Columbia tent encampments, but the university retracted the suspension within a day after reviewing their evidence. Columbia University President's office called him to apologize for their mistake. Columbia administrators described Khalil as a principled, good-faith negotiator who worked with them to reduce encampments. In September 2024, after new demonstrations began on campus, Khalil said students would continue to protest as long as Columbia continues to invest and to benefit from Israeli apartheid, and that this might include further encampments or other forms of protest. On March 6, 2025, Columbia's newly created Office of Institutional Equity opened investigations into students who had been critical of Israel, including Khalil and a number of Jewish students, in order to address complaints of rising anti-Semitism on campus. Amy Greer, a lawyer advising several students, said that Columbia was bowing to governmental pressure to suppress and chill protected speech. A number of accusations related to Khalil's involvement in CUAD include his alleged role in organizing a march where some participants purportedly glorified the October 7th Hamas-led attack on Israel and circulated social media posts critical of Zionism. Khalil said most of the 13 allegations against him related to social media posts he had nothing to do with. The university threatened to block Khalil from graduating for refusing to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but withdrew the threat after Khalil appealed through a lawyer. Discussing concerns about anti-Semitism, Khalil said there is, of course, no place for anti-Semitism. What we are witnessing is anti-Palestinian sentiment that's taking different forms, and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism are some of these forms.
Yeah, so based on what you just read, I don't think that it's fair, and I would never do this, by the way, of an individual similarly situated in like a conservative context, to ascribe to this individual for purposes of specifically negatively affected that individual the specific statements of an organization that he is not a member of.
Okay, I would. Now what?
Okay. So even assuming that you make that jump, which I think is completely unfair, I think people should be aware, right? We're not talking about any statements Mahmoud Khalil made. We're not talking about any statements that he made. We're talking about statements that we don't even know that he was aware that they were made. So in this case, I just want to be clear about what Connor is doing now. He is applying strict liability in the sense of making Mahmoud Khalil answerable to any statement made on behalf of CUAD in that time period, and however bad it is, regardless of his knowledge
let me
of
tell
it,
you why I think this is
regardless
reasonable.
of his involvement in making the statement, that's the standard you're imposing on him, just to be clear.
Yeah, let me tell you why I think this is reasonable. So Mahmoud Khalil at the time was there on a student visa, which means that he's here as a guest in our country. I know he became a lawful permanent resident or had a green card, later on. However, at the time, he was a student, which means that he's coming here for his education. He's coming here in order to achieve a temporary result in our country. And yet he is passionately and insistently involving himself
You're zooming
with
out.
CUAD
You're zooming out.
and negotiating on their behalf. You're of occupations of buildings. That's 100% more than enough to create association.
The only thing that I'm talking about right now is whether or not you can attribute to him those statements. Now, you could say he's deportable because of his association with those individuals, and then I think it's an even harder case. But
yeah. Let's go ahead and test this. Let's say that there's Russia is being taken over by Nazis, and then there's pro-Nazi protests where they're occupying buildings on the state, on the student grounds. And I'm a visitor from Russia. Make it Germany. I don't give a shit. But make it some country that has a Nazi problem, right? And then I hang out with the Nazis. I talk on behalf of the Nazis. I organize Nazi protests. And then I talk to the student admin and I say, hey, I'm not a Nazi, but, I'm trying to stay on the right side of the law. But I am going to hang out with them. I am going to protest them. I am going to organize marches on their behalf. And I'm going to negotiate with you in order to reduce the damage done by the Nazi protesters. Are you saying that it's unfair to characterize me as either a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer?
That's not what I said. That's not what I said.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
So I want to be clear. I just am saying, can you attribute those statements to him without specific knowledge that he was aware of them, knowing of them, supporting of them, or any evidence?
No,
that he was
I don't have that
them?
evidence, and okay. I already feel like I have sufficient evidence for what I'm talking about.
So what you're talking about is, generally his affiliations and sympathies with these kinds of individuals. And so I just want to be clear about what we're doing here, right?
Sure. Lactoid brings up, let's do January 6th. Let's say I'm a negotiator on behalf of January 6th protesters who are occupying Congress. Are you saying that I could just be a good Samaritan standby person who's just negotiating on behalf of the January 6ers?
So to be 100% clear, it absolutely applies in the Jan 6 situation. If there were some kind of negotiation, and if there's no evidence that person was involved in criminal activity, you said, by the way, that you don't have any evidence that he was involved in criminal activity and that he merely had sympathies with the people in Jan 6. So just to be clear, in this instance, there are a lot of people in this country who have sympathies with Jan 6 who are not involved in criminal activity.
Fuck 'em.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people who showed up that day who did not do anything criminal and who are protected by the First Amendment. And I would, just as I'm doing right now, even though they may support the criminal activity that's going on there, I would be absolutely defending their rights. And if someone said, hey, we're going to use one of these people who's outside of the Congress, is not actually engaged in criminal activity, to negotiate on behalf of people with whom he has sympathies, I would not necessarily attribute everything that's done in that Congress, whether that's the statements made or criminal actions made, to that individual with respect to specific penalties applied to that individual.
I would.
That's insane. So so you're going to apply?
No. So you're saying, so let's go ahead and divide it up into two camps, okay? There's people who remained outside the building and there's people who remained inside the building, okay? Let's say that there's people
don't just say building, restricted area. It's broader than the building, but yeah.
Okay, so the Capitol, whatever associations you want to make with the Capitol, they don't have authorization to be there, right? So we have people who trespass, vandalize property, assault law enforcement officers, they riot, they do all that kind of crap. And on top of that, they were trying to hunt down members of Congress in order to presumably take them into some level of custody where they could render the people's justice onto these people.
Yeah, I don't have.
And then we have somebody who stands outside. I'm not done.
Yep.
I have somebody who stands outside of Congress and he's like, listen, I'm not about that, hanging Mike Pence shit, but I'm pretty much down with everything else. So I'm going to negotiate on the people inside of the building. I'm going to negotiate on their behalf with law enforcement in order to secure the de-escalation. You're saying that that is insufficient ground. And on top of that, the people who are inside the building know that person well enough to appoint them as the negotiator. Insufficient
grounds for what is the question? Insufficient grounds for what?
If they were a non-citizen, I would remove them from the country immediately.
Okay, so
if they were an Indian sympathizer with January 6 rioters and they had a temporary student status in the United States of America, I would deport that motherfucker back to India faster than your head could spin.
Okay, so someone who is, just to be clear, someone who does no criminal conduct, makes no explicitly supportive statements on behalf of, what you would consider to be the problematic beliefs, or the immediately deportable beliefs.
Yeah, but associates with people who do make criminal conduct or who do commit criminal conduct and people who do support criminal beliefs. Yeah, if they were a non-citizen, I would 100% support their deportation immediately.
We'll get to that, but let's just be clear about one thing. This would also apply to racism.
Sure, if they're non-citizens.
So just to be clear, if someone supports
there are different
racism,
classes of people who have different levels of protection.
So let's paint a picture right now. The administration is going through social media as they're trying to get people. So if the administration did roughly the same thing with racists, people who they consider to be racists.
Sure. If there was a Klan member who was coming in from another country and basically what was it?
No, they're like, it's microaggressions.
I hate K-slurs. And I think that we should, I think that K-slurs are a threat and a blight on American society. And the sooner that Americans wake up to the threats of international Jewry, the better. I would deport that person in a heartbeat.
Let's take another instance. So someone who associates with like a frat, and the frat is known to say horrible, sexist things. All the frat members, they're obviously like First Amendment protected citizens. But this guy, he's not a member of the frat, but he associates with the frat, and they're all saying the most vicious, vile, sexist things. And he's best friends with them who are saying vicious, vile, sexist things. They're standing up for patriarchy. Oh my God.
Fuck him. He's not a member of the society. The whole point of coming to the United States of America is to be a healthy, happy member of society. If you're going to be an antisocial, economic or social blight on our country, you don't have a right to our country.
Trump supporters. If you're a Trump supporter.
If you're a foreign Trump supporter who supports anti-governmental action, then you should be deported.
Just anti-government belief. You don't have an explicit statement from, let's say, I don't support the criminal activity. I just, I'm in favor of.
It gets into a little bit of a function of the, what's like a reasonable belief.
What's worse,
but if you start testing the limits of reasonable beliefs, then I'm going to support it.
What's worse, sexism or Trump?
Let's say he's a QAnoner. Then 100% deport his ass.
What's worse? Supporting Trump or being a sexist?
I would say supporting Trump.
Okay. So if you're going to deport people who associate with vicious sexists, why wouldn't you deport people who associate with big Trumpers?
If they're hold on. We need to delineate the line here. Okay. Mm-hmm. There is operating within the framework of our liberal representative democratic society. Okay. So let's say that there is a person who says, I support Republicans over Democrats. I want to make America great again. I think that Donald Trump is fighting for the future of America. Like everything like Elon Musk says, right? Let's say that they're saying that. If they're advocating, relatively speaking, to participate in the democratic system that we have as it currently exists, then I don't think that person should be subject to deportation. However, if they say, all hail God Emperor Trump, the Constitution.
Yeah, but you don't
burn
have
this country to the ground.
Have any statements from Mahmoud Khalil.
Deport him.
But you don't have any statements from Mahmoud Khalil. All you have are his associations with a group that you find distasteful, and that you find that
distasteful is putting it very mildly, by the way.
But let's be 100% clear. So you're not pointing to specific statements of Mahmoud Khalil. You just said that his mere
he's just hanging out with the equivalent of QAnon.
Okay, so if you have an immigrant who's hanging out with the most vile MAGA people who are just very pro MAGA and racist, you would deport the person on the basis of his support for Trump and him hanging out with bad MAGA people. You would deport him.
Yeah, if they were calling Amy Coney Barrett. No, hold on. I'm going to articulate this.
Not the individual.
If a non-citizen.
So not the individual.
If a non-citizen, I'm going to articulate it.
Yeah.
So if a non-citizen was posting on social media, Amy Coney Barrett is a traitor to this country. Deport.
Okay, but I just gave you the example. We're not pointing to specific statements made by the non-citizen. We're pointing.
That's still protected speech. That would still be protected speech. I think it would be analogous to what Mahmoud Khalil did state.
We have it. Just to be clear, this is not my main argument. My main argument is going to be legal and grounded in the First Amendment, and we haven't even touched it yet. All we're talking about here is your like morals and priors here, and how willing I think you are to bend them, and how I think this rule is just you're making a rod for your own back.
What principle am I bending?
Well, I think that I don't know if it's a principle you're bending, but I think your intuition is that you shouldn't deport people because they support Trump.
Supporting Trump is insufficient for deportation. It's how they support Trump.
Okay. How would someone go about supporting Trump in a way that you think is grounds for deportation?
We already talked about that. So
in a neutral way,
let's say January 6th is going down.
Without giving an example, can you give some kind of neutral criteria? That I don't have to give.
Yeah, I would say aiding a nefarious anti-governmental organization.
Okay. All right. Listen, I think that is far too broad in terms of my morals. But let's get to the actual law here, and I think this is we're exploding the bases of deportation under this. But I think that you agree that it is, if it's against the First Amendment to take a certain action, it should not be done. Fair?
Sorry, say that again so I can understand what you're getting at.
If it violates the Constitution to take a certain government action, that government action should not be taken.
Yes, we should follow the Constitution as much as possible.
Okay. And
I'm going to take a bite of my breakfast.
I'm go for it. Do you believe that non-citizens have First Amendment rights?
I think they have limited First Amendment rights.
They have at least some First Amendment rights. Is that fair?
They have some.
Okay. Do you think that the First Amendment can ever be applicable in deportation proceedings?
Yes.
So, for example, you were deported on the basis, let's say that you said, I really like Sammy Sosa, or I really like the show Hamilton, and you expressed a belief like that, and someone deported you on the basis of that, or purported or tried to deport you on the basis of your expressed avowed belief that Hamilton's a good play, you would think that is, but let's assume that there's a law that lets them deport you for any reason, right? There's a law that says you may deport them for any reason. Notwithstanding the law says that generally, if you tried to use that law to deport someone on the basis of their avowed support for Hamilton, a non-citizen, you think that would be a violation of the First Amendment?
It would be anti-constitutional and should be struck down.
Okay. So, what we've narrowed, I want to say this for the audience, I think that you're following along fine, Connor. We've already recognized that deportation is not something that is outside of the category of the First Amendment, right? Because in this example, Connor has accepted this kind of like very milquetoast opinion. If it were uttered and there were a deportation on that basis, it would raise a First Amendment issue there. In other words, the exercise of immigration authority, the mere fact that it's being exercised does not make it a non-First Amendment issue. That there can be First Amendment issues with respect to deportation. And there's a second part to that, which is even if the law says that an immigration officer or court or the government can deport you for any reason, right? The law, the statute says that. When I say law in this context, I'm saying the statute. Even if the statute says we can deport you for any reason or for no reason, if that's what the law states, if the reason is because of protected speech, in this case, the support for the play, notwithstanding the fact that the law says I can deport you for any reason I want, it would nonetheless be unconstitutional to deport them. Fair?
I'm going to try to split just because I'm not sure if I'm tracking wholly.
Yeah.
There are classes of people and their rights are reasonably limited, and we accept this for every constitutional amendment. And so there are reasonable limits to the speech that's allowed by aliens.
But I just want to get the principle out, which is, at least for some non-citizens, at least for some deportation matters, when there is a deportation, however broad the grant of authority to deport,
you can't use the "I can deport you for any reason" card as the reason for why you're doing it if it's anti-constitutional.
Right. So
you need to articulate the reasonable limit for why you're participating in the deportation.
The reason I say this is because often in the Twitter replies, I see you citing the INA as a basis of deportation, when I can grant to you that the INA says that the Secretary of State can make a determination as to whether or not someone is going to be, a significant threat to foreign policy, which is one of the basis of his deportation, which is absolutely ridiculous, the statutory basis. But I can grant you that the INA gives vast deference to the government. And even, they could make some kind of facial plausible claim and state out there, and even grant that Mahmoud Khalil has some of these pernicious beliefs or has said some bad statements. Notwithstanding that, even if the INA says that, you can't just cite the INA and be done with you need to do the First Amendment analysis, because having a very broad INA is not sufficient to see if it's legal or illegal, because you have to do the First Amendment analysis. And so, great.
Okay, what do you think about my specific substatute?
Yeah. So you've cited 237, his involvement or support of a terrorist group, right? Let's get the actual deportation statute.
8 USC 8 USC 1227 and 8 USC 1182. Do you want me to read it?
So it's I know it. So this is a basis of inadmissibility that the deportation. So just to be clear, so there's a part. He's a already inspected and admitted alien, and so he's subject to the basis of deportability. One of the bases of deportability maps onto a basis of inadmissibility, and that's what he's citing right now. And that is a terrorism-based statute. Let me go to the actual.
Can I read it for chat's benefit?
Yes, read it.
Okay. So this is 8 USC 1227 deportable aliens. And subsection 4 is security and related grounds. So this is any alien who is engaged, or at any time after admission engages in any activity to violate any law of the United States, any other criminal activity which endangers public safety, or any activity a purpose of which is in opposition to or the control or overthrow of the government of the United States by force, violence, or other unlawful means, is deportable. And then they go on to subsection B, which involves terrorist activities. Any alien who is described in subparagraph B or F, section 1182A3. And then let me go down to 1182A3, okay?
Yep.
So 1182, and then A3 has in it terrorist activities. And there's like 10 subsections, but I think the one that I would focus on is 7, which says endorses or espouses terrorist activity or persuades others to endorse or espouse terrorist activity or support a terrorist organization. Now, where you're going to disconnect, I'm going to predict something. You're going to disconnect Mahmoud from CUAD. What I'm going to say is CUAD, regardless of whether or not they're aliens or citizens, they violated subsection 7, obviously.
So just give me a second. I'm showing the audience. I'm covering your face.
That's fine.
So what you said is, on the basis of him being an alien who, you agree he has not engaged in terrorist activity, fair? You can't prove that.
I'd have to see the way the subsections break down. Basically,
terrorist activity is defined as someone who is involved in activities that include the hijacking or sabotage of any conveyance, the seizing or detaining or threatening to kill, injure, or continue to detain any individual in order to compel a third person to do or abstain from doing any act as an explicit or implicit condition for the release of the individual, a violent attack upon an internationally protected person as defined in another subsection, or upon the liberty of such a person, an assassination, the use of a biological agent, chemical agent, or nuclear weapon or device, or explosive firearm or other weapons or dangerous device with intent to endanger directly or indirectly the safety of one or more
he has
individuals,
not.
a threat or attempt or
Mahmoud
conspiracy.
Khalil himself has not engaged in terrorist activity.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
You agree that there's no evidence here to support the notion that that there are reasonable grounds to believe that he is likely to engage in terrorist activity? Fair? That he himself is
likely. Likely is a weird term. I don't think, and he doesn't have any more of a threat of committing a terrorist attack than any other person who vaguely supports Palestine.
Okay, great. So it's insufficient for under 2. 3, has under circumstances indicated an intention to cause death or serious bodily injury and incited terrorist activity. You agree that he doesn't meet that, right? He hasn't indicated an intention to cause death or serious bodily injury, right?
Correct.
All right. So we're not under sub 3. Sub 4, is a representative of a terrorist organization or a political, social, or other group that endorses or espouses terrorist activity. Here you would say CUAD, right?
Probably, yeah.
Is a representative as defined in Clause 5. Representative includes any officer, official, or spokesman of any organization and any person who directs, counsels, commands, or induces an organization or its members to engage in terrorist activities. So is he an officer of CUAD?
It can be argued.
Wait, you said before that you don't have any evidence that he is an official member of CUAD.
Yeah, it'd be based off of inference.
Well, so do you have sufficient evidence to deport him that he is an officer of CUAD?
I don't know what the threshold for deportation is.
Well, do you think it's more? Do you have enough evidence to establish more likely than not that he is an officer of CUAD? An actual
I think
officer?
so, yeah.
Oh,
I think so, yeah.
So if I say that I support CUAD, do you think I'm an officer of CUAD?
No, but if you start negotiating on their behalf, I think it would be reasonable to assume that you are. Why would they appoint you to negotiate with the school administration if you weren't a member or weren't an important part of the organization?
Wait, you know that could happen. Supposedly, right? Someone who's a negotiator, right, is someone who maybe has credibility, who isn't.
So hold on, I'll play your game. Do you think that should be investigated?
Wait, investigate whether or not he is a member of CUAD?
Yeah, sure.
No, I don't.
Why not?
Because I don't think it's a crime to be a member of CUAD.
You just said that arguably that if you're established as an officer of an organization, then you would be subject to deportation under these laws. And then you're saying we should investigate whether or not he was actually an officer.
No, because so I just want to be clear. This is the statutory argument. I think that all of this is obviated by the First Amendment. So I'm just playing the statutory argument first. But I will get the First Amendment argument. Okay. And so, no, unless there's reason to believe that he committed a crime or...
What about from a legalistic basis? Do you think that, let's just say, throw your morals out the window for a moment. As an agent of the state, you know that if you establish that he's an officer of this organization, then you might have grounds for deportation.
Well, No.
Sorry, go ahead.
So the First Amendment is the supreme law of the land, and I believe that even if it were shown that he were a member of CUAD, his deportation on the basis of this statute and this provision would be unconstitutional on the First Amendment. I'm just going through the statutory argument first, because I have, obviously the First Amendment will trump all of this, but I'm just telling you that I want to go through your basis of deportation.
Then we can go... I have no problems walking through it for the sake of thoroughness, and then also just because then we don't have to have Twitter spats about things that we didn't discuss. However, I think that where we're going to get to the kind of like the final contention, the fireworks of our conversation, is going to be on like the reasonableness limits to the Constitution.
Yeah,
so, but I'm happy to continue.
This will probably ground out in the First Amendment. I probably agree with that. But you don't have, right? Just because someone negotiates is an intermediary between one group and another group doesn't mean that you're a member of either group, right? Is it reasonable to think that he's a member of Columbia?
If I was a member of the Department of State and I wished to deport Mahmoud Khalil under the substatute, I would investigate further whether or not he was an actual identifiable officer.
Whether you would investigate further or not, we don't know that we don't have enough evidence to say that he's an officer. Just because he negotiated, any more than he is. Okay.
I would investigate. I would investigate further so I could substantiate that in court.
Okay. So we don't have any evidence. I think by the same token that he's an official of that organization. We don't have evidence of that, or that he's an official, a spokesman of the organization. Right? Does he hold himself out as being a spokesman of CUAD? Not that I know of.
We could reread the paragraph that we read earlier if you want.
What do you mean? What paragraph? The one where he's.
It was in the opening.
Hanging out with members?
Deportation of Mahmoud Khalil.
The one where he's hanging out with members?
Yeah, but they also... there was some weird phrasing. There was some weird phrasing where they like appointed him. It might have just been the negotiations. Following and was often seen unmasked in front. Was often seen unmasked on the front line of protests.
Right? Does that make him an officer, official, or spokesman of
no? But if you're saying he said CUAD supported social justice and freedom and equality for everyone.
So? Why are you?
I could say on that. The front line of the protest, arm in arm with CUAD representatives, and you're talking about the principles of the organization, but you're not a spokesperson.
Organizations can have allies, and a spokesperson is a specific thing. A spokesperson is someone who speaks on behalf of an organization, so that when he speaks, he's speaking with the voice of an organization. It's a role, right? It's one where you are a member of that organization and you're speaking on its behalf.
In order for us to establish that he was a spokesperson for the organization or an officer, they effectively need to have. By the way, this doesn't even function in like criminal prosecutions. Okay.
What do you mean?
So if there's a drug organization and there's people who are hanging out with each other, and then one person launders the money, and then one person does this, and then one person does that, and this person's lieutenant, and this person's that.
Yeah, wait.
Then it doesn't stand up in court. Hold on, I'm not done. It doesn't stand up in court where there's one guy who like takes money and does storage for drugs and does storage for guns, and then like they call him. And, they call him into court in order to prosecute him for like criminal conspiracy. And then he's like, oh yeah, like I wasn't a part of the gang. I just offered these random guys storage. Yeah. And it's like, no, that's not going to work as far as like denying culpability for being a member of a criminal organization.
Right.
So hold on real quick.
Yeah.
So we have him at the protest. We have him arm in arm with CUAD members. We have him talking about the principles of the organization, and we have him negotiating with the school administration on the release of buildings that are occupied by CUAD members. And you're saying like, yeah, well, we can't prove that he's a part of the organization.
You can't prove that he's a member of the organization.
It's like I would say there's reasonable grounds to believe that he is a member of the organization, 100%.
Based on the fact that he is, in common cause with them. It's a specific organization.
And spoke about their principles and was on the front line of protests and negotiated their release of held buildings.
Okay,
yeah, 100%.
So someone who, would you say that everyone on January 6th is a member of the Proud Boys?
No.
Why not?
But no, hold on.
Oh!
If there was a non-citizen, I don't know why you're laughing, because this is just, I'm literally just going to repeat back to you. So if there was a guy
floundering
who was next to the Proud Boys, talked about the Proud Boys' values, and then negotiated on the Proud Boys' behalf the release of the building of, release Congress, which is being occupied by the Proud Boys, I would have no problems with saying, you're close enough to the Proud Boys, you get deported.
I'm not asking.
Why wouldn't you? As a matter of fact, hold on. You've been on the offensive the entire time. You've been on the offensive the entire time. I'm going to ask you. What? So we have a foreign national. He comes to the United States of America. As a matter of fact, Ian Miles Chong, okay? Ian Miles Chong, a Malaysian national, comes here on a student visa. He becomes best friends with the Proud Boys, but he's not a member. He goes to January 6th. He doesn't occupy the buildings, but the Proud Boys do. Then he negotiates with law enforcement the release of Congress. And you want, on First Amendment grounds, for Ian Miles Chong to remain in the country.
Bro, you've exploded. You've exploded everything out.
No, it's almost 1-to-1. It's almost 1-to-1.
So if his conduct, it's really, really not, just to be clear. If his conduct...
It really, really is.
If his conduct is pure protected speech, then no. I would not support his deportation. No, but you've now so because you know that I got you, you have blown out what we were talking about to talk about.
And you didn't get shit.
To talk about the deportation in general, because now I have to consider everything when I answer you about Ian Miles Chong. I have to consider the First Amendment. We're not talking about the First Amendment yet, and you've exploded everything. We were talking about very narrow, specific things. We were talking about whether or not what makes someone a member of an organization, what it would take to show someone's a spokesperson of an organization, and you've blown it out now to give my general take on a hypothetical on every conceivable ground and whether I would the ultimate deportation decision. We were just talking about what makes someone an officer, official, or spokesman of an organization, and because you know it's untenable for you to say just because you walk hand in hand with, just because you have common interests with, because that would marry you
No,
to the notion that
you're not talking to me. You're not talking to me. You're talking to my chat, and you're trying to say that I'm blowing up the conversation and trying to avoid your point. I'm not trying to avoid your point at all. And as a matter of fact, I'm trying to test your principles. What I'm trying to do, which you can say like my principles are unshakable. I hold this even for my enemies. Well, good for you, Pisco. These aren't my principles.
No.
Basically,
you're blowing up the conversation right now. Everyone can see you doing it.
No,
and it's embarrassing. Yeah, you are. So we're talking about
we can return to your niche conversation about an officer any second now. You act like I'm retarded and I have a goldfish memory, so I forgot what we were talking about 30 seconds ago.
I'm glad you recognize that you changed the subject.
Hold on. All I did was I took what you're pointing at, and then I used an almost one-to-one analogy for a political opposition to see whether or not you would hold the same principles.
And I would.
You say you do, and I kind of don't believe you, but that's okay. We can return to the officer conversation. Let's do it.
All right. So
let's unblow up the conversation. Let's go back to the detail.
You agree, by the way, that so if someone is walking hand in hand with the Proud Boys on January 6th, doesn't make them a member, doesn't make them an officer, doesn't make them a spokesperson, even if they praise the group.
It makes them sufficient for me to deport them. Under the same grounds that I would deport Mahmoud
That's not what you keep blowing it up. Would that make them an
not.
officer, official, or spokesman of an organization?
No.
Okay, so
it would still be sufficient grounds for me to deport them for other reasons.
That could be separate, but at least with respect to whether or not they're an officer, official, or spokesperson, just because you say statements that generally are praising of an organization.
But I'm going to push you right back because you're going to say we shouldn't even investigate it.
Well,
you're saying we shouldn't even investigate whether or not they're a member, whether or not they're an officer or a spokesperson.
Because I think this is all obviated by the First Amendment. So because I don't believe it to be a crime to be a member of the CUAD, why would I investigate some?
We can continue. I don't agree.
This is just a statutory argument, so we're not at the main argument. So I would say, even if you could grant that he was an officer, official, or spokesman, I would say it would be protected by the First Amendment. What I'm saying is, you can't prove that. You can't prove, based on the evidence that currently exists, that he's an officer, official, or spokesman of an organization. If he's not a representative as defined in the statute, he cannot be subject to the ground of deportation that it says that he's a representative of such an organization.
My rebuttal is that number one, it can be logically inferred. Number two, it's close enough for me to not care.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it. We'll go to the First Amendment right away because I don't want to test your patience. But let it be known that I think the statutory argument is far from shown. And to be clear, no one is going to be arguing this point in court because this isn't the basis of deportation that anyone cited. The basis of deportation that was actually cited by the government was that he's a serious threat to the foreign policy interests of the United States, which is patently fucking absurd. If you read the 2-page memo that they have about why he's a big foreign policy threat, it's because he attended protests in which there was anti-Semitism and disruptive activity. That's it. That's all it is. And so even if I were to grant, which I don't, that your statutory argument goes through, it doesn't. Their statutory argument certainly does not go through, that Marco Rubio can just decide, oh, you're anti-Semitic, or you were in a place where there was disruption or anti-Semitism, and therefore that makes you deportable under the statute. So I don't agree that he's deportable under the statute. But because that, I think, argument, I think it's not interesting as much as the First Amendment argument for the people, we can move on to that. But I just want to be clear. What you just heard from Connor isn't what the government is saying. And the reason why, I think one of the main reasons why the government isn't saying that is two. A, they want to do the loosest possible standard so they can apply in the broadest possible way, even people who are doing no more than peacefully signaling their support for the Palestinians, separate and apart from what happened in Colombia. So here we have people who are like releasing op-eds, people who have no connection whatsoever to the Colombia protests, people who just support Palestine. They're using AI. And so it's not at all what's going on here is way broader than what Connor is saying. And I don't even think Connor's argument goes through. But that's just on the statutory basis. We can move on to the First Amendment. So I'm going to grant for the purpose of this argument that Mahmoud Khalil, not only is he a member of CUAD, he supports Hamas explicitly. And he says that he thinks Hamas is good and he thinks that October 7th was justified. Even then, I don't think that I think it's authoritarian to deport him on that basis. Why? Because the First Amendment protects him, and the First Amendment would protect a similarly situated U.S. citizen in that context. And I don't think that there's a sufficient distinction that you can make in this context to distinguish the right of an American citizen from that of a green card holder in this specific context that could be, I think, justifiable. So what's the justification for saying, on the one hand, U.S. citizens should have the right to say they support Hamas, but not green card holders?
Okay. Does the Second Amendment apply to non-citizens?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Well,
Do you know the
wait a
nuances of that?
Wait a second. You would say that you agree, right? That the First Amendment applies to non-citizens. I think you said you would agree also, or I think you would, that the Second Amendment applies to non-citizens.
Yeah. So let's test the limits of that.
Yeah.
So do you know the different categories of how the Second Amendment applies to non-citizens?
I'm not immediately familiar with the different categories.
And for those of you who are unaware, sorry, real quick, I'll give people some backstory. So the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Mm-hmm. I think that if you look at historical context for that, it effectively grants people the right to keep and bear arms, and it's the people, not the militia, who is granted that right. I think that if you look at historical context, that's what it means.
That's what the Supreme Court tells us. I don't have to agree with it to accept that that's the law of the land.
Okay, so it's the law of the land that the people have a right to keep and bear arms.
There's an individual right to gun possession and whatever that right is, it applies to individuals.
Okay. So, and the people is a nondescript term sufficient that people, it didn't say citizen, right? If it said citizens, it would have said citizens.
Right.
It said people.
I think we agree on that.
But we place reasonable limits on the way that aliens can exercise their Second Amendment rights.
Oh?
And the reasonable limits as presently established is that temporary visa holders do not have a Second Amendment right. Okay? They don't. Okay? They do not have the right to keep and bear arms. Then when it comes to permanent residents, they have to apply to the government in order to exercise their Second Amendment
According
right.
to what? To the statutes? To the statutes or to case law?
I don't know what you're asking.
So if there's a law, a written legislative enactment that says that non-citizens have to get permits above and beyond what citizens get, or they have to go through extra checks, or that certain non-citizens are not allowed to possess certain guns, just because the law says that doesn't mean the Second Amendment allows for it, right? There are a lot of laws on the books right now that Second Amendment advocates say is unconstitutional. They just haven't reached the stage.
But we apply in order to live in a functional society. We apply reasonableness limits to laws all of the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. We apply limits on rights all the time. So, for example, in the First Amendment does not protect defamation, doesn't protect incitement, doesn't protect material support for a terrorist organization, doesn't protect assault or harassment if it's done verbally, right? So there are absolutely categorical exceptions.
Sorry, assault in the state of Florida is verbal.
Yes.
It's not physical.
Well, it's putting someone in fear, reasonable fear of their, that they're going to receive an offensive touching.
So there's reasonable limits to the First Amendment, Second Amendment.
Yeah, but those are categorical exceptions apply to the First Amendment that exist as to citizens as well. And so I agree there could be some limits on First Amendment activities based on whether or not you're an alien or not, but you have to justify this particular categorical exception in a way that doesn't just blow up the right and now they have no rights, because I think that's what will happen if we test it.
Yeah. So let's get there. But I'll just punch ahead, and I won't try to walk you down the logic chain. I'll just explain my logic chain. Okay.
Yeah.
So my frustration with liberals and with progressives is that they seem to be First Amendment absolutists, whereas they scoff and laugh at Second Amendment absolutists. And I've kind of moved politically, I would say probably in the past 5 years, from a Second Amendment absolutist to now understanding the nuances of the law and the limits of it, et cetera. So as an example, if there was a public hospital, so I part own it by, as a taxpayer, I'm a paying member of this community, that doesn't give me the ability to walk in with any arm, keep and bear arms, right? I can't bear arms and walk into their nursery and expect to go unchallenged, not asked to leave, not told that I'm trespassing, and not eventually arrested if I refuse, right? That could be argued to be a infringement on my Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms.
Well, we wouldn't say that way. We would say the Second Amendment was always understood to not be a right that's absolute. As initially enacted, there was an understanding that the Second Amendment would cover some things and not cover other things. So, for example, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, abridging the free speech, right? And so we understand the First Amendment does not apply to private conduct unless it's coerced by the government, right? It doesn't apply to things like Twitter, except to the extent that the government's coercing, right? The First Amendment also does not apply to child pornography. And so it's not a violation of your First Amendment right to make child pornography illegal. The right simply does not cover those categorical exceptions. It does not cover defamation. So the First Amendment right does not protect your right to...
Tell me why so I can follow you. So
Yeah.
if you're not being an absolutist, why are the categorical exceptions carved out?
They're usually grounded out in history and tradition. So, for example, in the context of the Second Amendment, they've told us explicitly that we, based on Bruin, that we are to look to near the time of the founding to see if there are like sort of parallel regulations in the time of the founding that sort of indicated and understood what the founders and framers thought that the right encompassed and what it did not encompass. In the case of the First Amendment, it was incorporated in a lot of the English common law, feelings of what an Englishman's right to free speech was, and this included, there were defamation actions all the time in the English common law. There was exceptions to the First Amendment in that context as well, and over time, also the courts have developed a framework of dealing with rights more generally. It's called the tiers of scrutiny framework, and that is sometimes when there's a really compelling government interest, the right stands as an obstacle, and you need to show a compelling purpose that's narrowly tailored in order to get over that right. So I'll give you an example. You could argue that the First Amendment, I think explicitly it's supported, is not just freedom of speech, it's also the freedom to assemble, right? And so any regulation during COVID, you could argue, right, is presumably, if you're saying
violation
that,
of the First Amendment, yeah.
but there are certain instances in which the government is it was always understood that in times of crises, there can be limitations on those rights. And so if there's a stay-at-home order during COVID, there's going to be a test, and the First Amendment will stand as a humongous restriction on the government's ability to do what they want to do, but it's going to be a real test. And so to answer your question completely, both history and tradition and this kind of tiers of scrutiny framework that we use. The problem is none of those are going to help you with respect to these deportation matters, neither the tiers of scrutiny analysis or the historical analysis.
Well, I mean, we can get into that
Okay.
because I disagree. And then also, I could argue the compelling government interest already. Jihadist terrorism has been an international blight on not just the United States, but the entire world. The Hamas, Hezbollah, the organizations that are being glorified by CUAD are jihadist organizations. The very framework that makes terrorism possible is explicitly stated in CUAD documents. And so as a result, they are absolutely glorifying jihadist terrorism. And so if there is somebody who is providing support for CUAD, and CUAD is in turn providing support for jihadist terrorism and anti-governmental revolutionary sentiment, which, by the way, they also do, the document is filled with references to revolutionary Maoist concepts. And so as a result, citizens are our cross to bear. So we will bear our citizens with a certain level of cringe. Aliens are not our cross to bear, and therefore they can get the out.
So you just made an impermissible step that is reprehensible under the tiers of scrutiny analysis. So if it's true that what you've identified as a compelling purpose and the regulation, if it's true, right? It's true just as much as aliens as it is of citizens. In fact, I would say it's more problematic with respect to citizens. Because citizens who espouse beliefs and support for Hamas, they're able to get access to government institutions in ways that non-citizens are not. They are, just as much. There are homegrown citizen terrorists who have done ISIS attacks, who are citizens, right? And so any compelling purpose that is going to justify a restriction of the support of Hamas and of terrorist organizations with respect to aliens, that compelling purpose and narrow justification is also going to be true of citizens. And so I don't understand the distinction there. Well, I think you would agree, I don't know if you would, that a U.S. citizen that says, I support Hamas, that is protected speech. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So if it were true that I were to accept your tiers of scrutiny analysis in which we have a compelling government purpose that's narrowly tailored, then it can't be the case that that isn't applicable to U.S. citizens, right? I mean, why would it be? Why would we have this difference in the tiers of scrutiny analysis vis-a-vis a U.S. citizen and
because
an
we
alien?
have different classifications of people.
No, but that's the whole thing we're trying to prove, right? The whole thing we're trying to prove is the basis of treating them differently with respect to the speech, and so you have to justify that different category. You can't just assume it. That's begging the question.
I can do that very easily. Jihadist terrorism and terrorism in general is viewed differently in different parts of the world. There's a cultural normalcy with which terrorism is accepted in different parts of the world. I would say Palestine is an obvious example in which terrorism is way more supported than it is in the United States. You can actually back this up with Pew Research polls. And so what I would say is that if people are going to be allowed into our country from areas in which terrorism is more broadly supported, then they cannot be promoting that kind of behavior here.
Wait, but no, hang on a sec. So it could be the case that someone that you bring into the country from an area of the world is more likely to be, supporting of that kind of Islamic jihadism or whatever. That could be the case. But I could say that with Muslims.
I mean, it actually literally is the case.
I could say that.
Continue.
I could say that with Muslims.
Yeah.
Muslims are more likely to be sympathetic to the
support jihadism. 100%.
So if I said, for example, the following: it is the Secretary of State's determination and the President's determination that because of the inherent high likelihood of Muslims, non-citizens, to be sympathetic to terrorist activities abroad, we are hereby instituting a categorical ban on and rescinding of all Muslim green cards for every Muslim person in the country, and immediately engaging in deportation removal proceedings against all Muslims on the basis of their faith.
So let me tell you why I don't think you could do that. Is because while there is broader support for terrorism in, let's just call it the Muslim world, there are still, I don't know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, maybe upwards of like 90% of people who don't support like jihadist terrorism, and as a result their affinity with the religion of Islam is not sufficient grounds to say that they will be terrorist supporters. However, publicly sympathizing with terrorist organizations is sufficient grounds to say, nope, you're playing with fire, fuck you.
Wait a second. So in essence,
there's no logical inconsistency here. You can pretend there is. There isn't.
So you think that because an individual who expresses his support for Palestine, they're more likely to...
No, don't change it.
Wait. So in this case, we were not pointing to individualized statements from Mahmoud Khalil. We're pointing to his affiliation.
We're pointing to... Let's just point to CUAD. Let's just say that there's aliens who endorse... Put Mahmoud Khalil for a second aside, only because I think there's enough inferential information in order to deport him. You do not. Okay? We agree to disagree on Mahmoud Khalil specifically. For the sake of my argument, let's just say that there is a member of CUAD who is an alien who does endorse and stand behind the Maoist revolutionary sentiment and the jihadist supporting terrorism endorsing glorification. Let's just use him as a hypothetical person.
Yes.
Should that person be deported?
No.
That's what I want to argue.
No, because...
I say yes, absolutely.
So if you're going to protect that right of citizens on what you're trying to explain, because you do want to protect the right for him to be in support of that Maoist insurrection of citizens, right? So you definitely want to... I thought you just said that you would be okay with a U.S. citizen supporting Hamas. And you say that they can't...
Yeah, a U.S. citizen, not an alien.
So the mere advocacy of a U.S. citizen...
Should I clarify that I want the CUAD representative to be an alien for the sake of the hypothetical? Because I was asking about deportation.
I know you are. But so I want to clear this analytically in our heads for the audience's sake as well. So Counterpoint. Were you ever Counterpoints?
No, that was just something Steven said.
Okay. Counterpoints, Connor says, Connor, U.S. citizens should be allowed to advocate in favor of Hamas, right?
Yep.
Independently. Obviously, it's different if it's material support in which you're engaging.
I mean, it sucks, but I fall to the slippery slope argument of you can declare anyone a terrorist and therefore deport anyone to Bukele's gulag.
Okay, so he does not need to justify or us treating people or imposing a government restriction on someone who supports terrorism and that being sufficient for his rationale. He needs to justify why we would treat an alien who supports Hamas differently than a U.S. citizen who supports Hamas. And what I heard from him was, well, aliens who support Hamas are more likely to have kind of closer affinities to these individuals given their support for Hamas. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to say, all right, so suppose you have a U.S. citizen who is a Muslim who supports Hamas. A Muslim is also more likely to have those connections to those foreign countries. So I'll ask you, should a U.S. citizen Muslim be allowed to have a government restriction on the basis of their support for Hamas?
Yeah, what's actually interesting is naturalized versus born. So if you're born, you're on home base. It's done. Like you can say whatever the you want as long as it's not actually explicitly violent. When it comes to naturalized citizens, there actually is an exemption that within 5 years of naturalization, if you do express support for a terrorist organization, you can be denaturalized and deported.
Okay, well, I don't have to accept that that's constitutional, but put it to the side, right? So take a U.S.
citizen.
But
that already exists, and it's viewed as a reasonable limit.
So take a U.S. citizen who was born in this country, natural-born citizen.
Home base. He's free. He can be as psychotic and stupid as he wants.
So why doesn't that rationale push through? So on the one hand, you said the reason we distinguish between a U.S. citizen who supports Hamas and an alien who supports Hamas is, well, an alien who supports Hamas is more likely to have these kind of intricate ties with the actual terrorists on the ground. And so that's how you can treat it differently because, an alien is inherently more likely to have those ties. So is a Muslim.
It's also just antisocial behavior. You don't even have to make that argument. You can just say it's antisocial.
Okay, there are a lot of things that I could consider antisocial. We can't ground out our arguments on what's antisocial and what I consider to be social or antisocial.
Yeah, we can't. Hold up. Pisco, I'm going to pause you because you're talking a lot and I feel like you're not saying that much.
Okay.
Aliens absolutely can be barred from the country based off of antisocial behaviors. This is just true. If you look at the list of inadmissible and deportable aliens, it actually lists out probably hundreds, if not thousands, of codes of conduct that aliens who are seeking admission to the United States, citizens can get drunk. They can get DUIs. They can get into fistfights. They'll suffer legal consequences, but they can do all of those things. If an alien does those things, they will not be admitted into the United States.
I'm talking about something. I'm talking
already accepted as law.
I'm talking about something very specific here. I'm talking about the differential on how
you're dodging, you're running away, you're imploding the question.
I think you are distracting. This is so. I think that there could be.
No, I'm not. I'm literally not. You're saying that it is insufficient grounds for an alien to endorse terrorism for them to be either not admitted, or deported from the country. I'm saying it is sufficient grounds. And if you look at the law as written, you need to address this. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of behaviors that are legal for citizens, but will bar you from entry into the United States of America. That's just true. And you need to contend with that fact.
So I want to be incredibly clear. I have never stated that the rules are all equal as between citizens and non-citizens. I have never stated that there are things that non-citizens could do that would subject them to deportation that U.S. citizens can do freely. And so at no point am I saying there must be parity in all things between U.S. citizens and non-citizens?
It sounds like you're arguing that for the First Amendment.
No. So what I'm talking about specifically is a right that we agree both citizens and non-citizens have. We agree on that. And so there could be a ton of behaviors that, as applied to non-citizens, don't raise First Amendment concerns. So, for example, if you are a habitual drunkard, I do not consider that to be a First Amendment issue. I don't think that drinking to the point of excess or being an alcoholic raises First Amendment concerns under our typical understandings of what expressive conduct is. I don't think getting drunk, though you might think differently, constitutes a First Amendment issue. I think being a habitual drug user doesn't constitute a First Amendment issue. I think someone who, for example, is a wife beater, regardless of whether it's a crime to be a wife beater, that doesn't raise a First Amendment issue. So there are tons of things that I can say, neutral grounds that you could deport someone. For example,
what about the fourth?
You could just pass a law. You could just pass a law that says all green card holders need to leave the country because we just don't want green card holders here anymore. And that would be a neutral.
What about the fourth?
What fourth? The Fourth Amendment? The fourth what?
Yeah, so we also, I have no problems if we get back to your current
Yeah, I
point.
do want to, but go.
But I just want to say, the Fourth Amendment is like the right of a person to be secure in their persons and papers and blah, 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 unless they have a warrant.
That protects non-citizens,
right?
yeah.
Okay, relatively speaking, it protects non-citizens, but at the point of admission and during interviews for admissibility, they basically say, show us all of your shit or you're not getting in.
So there's a difference between an admission decision and a deportation decision. That's number one. And I'm just telling you what the case law is. There's a difference between an admission decision and non-admission decision. And the same is also true oftentimes of U.S. citizens. They have less rights in airports than you do elsewhere. Yeah, exactly. They can search under lower standards. And so absolutely agreed. And if you're applying for a benefit from the government, that doesn't raise the same kind of Fourth Amendment concerns under normal applications of the Fourth Amendment. And that's true of U.S. citizens as well. And so, yeah, I don't have a problem. I think that those are all resolvable by a resort to either usual principles of
listen. I have no problems. I have no problems listening to you and following you down your logic chain. I really don't. But I just want to make this clear for your audience and for my audience. There are, in my opinion, there are reasonable limits to the Fourth Amendment and the Second Amendment, and there's also categories of people that apply in the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment where the right applies to greater and lesser degrees depending on their categorization and class of person. And so what I'm looking for is for an argument of why the First Amendment somehow doesn't have that differentiation between class and category.
So I can give you examples where I do think that the First Amendment gives lesser degrees of rights to non-citizens. So I can give you some examples of that. But I just want to acknowledge there absolutely
But doesn't that help my point, not hurt it?
It helps the notion that I don't think that all rights are coextensive between, but there's a reason, right? I'm going to give you a difference in where non-citizens have lesser First Amendment rights than U.S. citizens. So I will give you those examples, but there are reasons for them that are based not just in the ickiness of the opinion itself. In other words, there are neutral, grounded principles for which we can distinguish those rights in those contexts. And I will explain those to you, and I will tell you about them. And I hope that you don't just use them in bad faith in future arguments to support your position. But maybe
I'll listen.
Yeah. So, but I just want to take for a second because you mentioned the Fourth Amendment. For example, you would agree if there's a resident alien who owns a home in the country, the police still need to get a warrant, right, for his house.
They need to get a warrant. Yep.
But why? I mean, why should they have to go? But they have different rights, right? They have different rights. And so why should they have to get a warrant?
Well, I would borderline say it depends on the class of person and the reason why they're here, right? So for instance, if we have if we have a permanent resident, right, then and they're here for owning and operating a laundromat, I don't think there's a compelling government interest in being able to violate his Fourth Amendment rights at all times.
Wait, you're assuming he has that.
However, hold on. I'm going to give you an example in which I think that the Fourth Amendment. Hold on. I'm going to give you an example in which I think the Fourth Amendment could be violated. Let's say that we had a worker visa for someone who was from a sensitive nation, let's say like Iran or China, and they were brought here specifically because of their expertise in a certain field, and that certain field had like national security implications, like nuclear technology, right? And they were working in the R&D labs, and they were working with like DARPA, like the defense agency, whatever. I would say that there could and should be a exemption where all of their personal objects are subject to search at almost all times.
Isn't that compelling interest true of U.S. citizens? If U.S. citizens have this kind of really sensitive material and they sort of sign up and they know that they're subject to, whatever, I think that applies to both U.S. citizens.
Some U.S. citizens do effectively sign away their Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah. So, for example, like felons who are on parole, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there are categories of unprotected, activities, or the right doesn't extend, and even in the context you provided seems pretty neutral, and I could apply it to U.S. citizens as well. What I want to do though is here's the example, right? A resident.
Yeah, I feel like I'm distracting us, so I'm going to let you take the reins.
Okay. So a legal permanent resident, lawful permanent resident. You agree, the police, all else equal, right? There are exceptions to the Fourth Amendment warrant requirement.
Sure.
Exigent circumstances, hot pursuit, plain sight. There are situations in which you don't need to get a warrant. You know that you're a cop. But under normal circumstances, you need to get a warrant. You agree that green card holders, all else equal, you need to get a warrant for them. If I came to you and I said, oh, but Connor, don't you know the Fourth Amendment rights are different? You can't just assume that the Fourth Amendment applies equally to citizens and to legal permanent residents. Isn't the burden on you to demonstrate why, in the normal instance, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to this example?
Yeah.
So what I hear a lot of times when I have this argument is you're assuming that green card holders
Hold on, Lisa Simpson liberal is very sad that I'm a police officer. Former police officer. Okay, I left law enforcement in 2019. You can spout ACAB in my chat.
Once a cop, always
anyway.
a cop. So when I talk about this issue, Mahmoud Khalil, I often get people who say, "Oh, you're just assuming that the First Amendment applies the same as citizens and non-citizens." I didn't say that. But if we take the first assumption that non-citizens, especially, well, let's just focus here on green card holders. Green card holders do have First Amendment rights. I think the burden of proof is on the individual asserting that there's some difference to establish that difference. Because in the example of the Fourth Amendment, or in the example, I can give you one of cruel and unusual punishment. If someone were to say, "Oh yes, they have a right against cruel and unusual punishment. Oh yes, they have a right against the unreasonable searches and seizures," but you can't just assume that it's the same right as U.S. citizens. I would be like, okay, you said they have the right as a base level. And so in order to justify a differential in how you treat the non-citizen versus the citizen, you need to provide that ground of distinction. And so bringing us back to the conversation we were at, you were saying, I was giving you the example of of someone who supports Hamas, a U.S. citizen. You said, you can't with that person. That person, he, like him or leave him, he's ours. And so I'm like, okay, so now we have that right, and we, as a base level, assume that green card holders, you agree, have First Amendment rights. You agreed, for example, that if he just supported Hamilton, you couldn't deport him. And that seems odd to me, number one, because First Amendment is supposed to protect political speech. So it seems weird that the green card holder would be protected in his kind of like non-political speech more than his political speech. If the First Amendment protects anything, surely it protects political speech more than non-political speech, but I'll leave it there.
Political speech isn't arbitrary, though. It's not all value neutral. This is actually why I get really fucking frustrated and pissed off with liberals. Not all politics is value neutral, nor has the history of the United States treated politics as value neutral. The whole reason why we fought the Civil War was because we disagreed about the context of slavery, and then the Union decided, hey, fuck you're gonna be a part of the Union. And then eventually they decided that slavery was going to be prohibited both legally and it was going to be enforced by military occupation. So we don't treat all political systems as value neutral. And so jihadist terrorism, or the advocacy for terrorism, is not value neutral speech. It's not as protected as saying that you like Hamilton. And by the way, this is like explained. Like you can appeal to the principle of the First Amendment. Hold on, I'm almost done. You can appeal to the principle of the First Amendment all the you want. This is perfectly articulated within 8 USC 1227 and 8 USC 1182. It says that the government has compelling interest in who it allows inside the borders of the United States and who gets to stay here. Therefore, here is the code of conduct that we expect aliens to abide by. And if they do not abide by these,
you keep going back to the statute,
then we're going to kick them the out. So you can appeal to principle all you want, but the law already agrees with me.
So you can't just keep appealing to the statute. I mean, I've told you.
Yes, I can.
You literally can't. Like I've explained to you.
Mahmoud Khalil is about to be deported. You are about to lose this
Why do you think that?
Why do I think that? Because a judge just ruled yesterday that he is liable for deportation.
An IJ who works for the Attorney General Pam Bondi, who you've already said is a liar and piece of shit, who's a member of the Department of Justice, ruled in violation of her oath that it's okay. But no one was ever expecting this to be resolved at the IJ stage. This is going to be resolved at the Supreme Court. This is going to be resolved in the appellate posture. And so you pointing to an IJ decision, it's all fugazi. The courts, the Article 3 courts, the real courts,
but Pisco, this is what pisses me off. It doesn't. I'm actually in a relatively good mood. But this is what frustrates me about conversations with you, okay?
Okay.
You act like you are 99% correct, and it's fucking absurd that anyone would ever consider the 1%.
Oh, God.
That is how you conduct conversation. This conversation has been actually relatively tame, so this conversation was great. I'm not talking shit about this.
So are you just like taking issue with my general demeanor?
Well, no. Well, I do take general issue with you retweeting yourself. But anyways, I've accepted that that's a part of your personality, and I have to accept you for who you are.
Okay.
My beef though is that you have people who are making these arguments in front of courts, and it's not a 99-1. It's like a 51-49. So when it goes up to the Supreme Court, they are going to make a decision based off of exactly what you and I are talking about. They're either going to say, no, the United States of America does have a compelling interest in who it admits into the United States of America, and these behaviors are definitely things that we can call like grounds for deportation and inadmissibility, or they're going to say, no, the First Amendment is sacrosanct, and we're actually going to extend an extreme amount of charity to aliens, and then therefore Pisco is right, and Pisco wins every internet debate for the next decade. Okay? So that's what's going to happen, and it is not 99-1 to you. It's 51-49 toss-up.
So I don't trust the Supreme Court to get the answer right here. I've not predicted.
Yeah, because they're conservative courts. Although they did just rule 9-0 in favor of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, so I think that we should take that as a dub.
I do take that as a dub, but I've never premised my argument based on a prediction of the Supreme Court's position. I take the precedent of the Supreme Court as a given. I look at it and I make what I believe to be the most compelling legal argument. I still believe that Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, notwithstanding the fact that I lost in the Supreme Court. And that belief is based on my constitutional analysis and my read of the pre-Anderson case law and what it says. So just because the Supreme Court might disagree with me, I'm not making a prediction based on the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
I'm making a prediction.
I'm appealing to practicality. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So what I want to talk about here, though, is the issue that we're here to talk about, which is this First Amendment issue. When you go back to the statutes, I will agree that there are a lot of constitutional applications of those statutes. In fact, probably most of those statutes are absolutely constitutional, and you could apply them to non-citizens. I agree that non-citizens have different rights than citizens. I agree that non-citizens have no substantive right to stay in the country, that Congress tomorrow, if they wanted to, could get rid of all green cards and deport every single non-citizen. These are all things I agree with. When you push, like pointing back in a kind of generic, abstract way to all of the bases of deportability and removability doesn't really help you in the argument. The argument is about the First Amendment specifically. And here we have a situation of core political speech. I actually think that the First Amendment protects more someone who says I support Hamas than someone who says I support Hamilton as a play. Because what were the framers animated about? What were they concerned about? They were concerned about people who were being trampled on by the king with respect to their political beliefs. And the Supreme Court has said as much. They've said that First Amendment rights are at their maximum when it relates to political speech. Now you can push at that and say, well, what's political, what's not political? And yeah, we can have reasonable disagreements on what that is. All I'm saying is the intuition, I think, is that any First Amendment principle is going to apply more strongly when it relates to the political decisions of foreign powers, when it relates to government decisions, all that stuff. And so that's just my intuition. It's kind of a side point, really. But here's the real point. The real point is this. You agree, just like in the Fourth Amendment context, that there's a kind of default right that these non-citizens have, and that I think the burden of proof is on you to establish the differential between the citizen's right and the non-citizen's right. I will give you the example of where the non-citizen's right is different and where it's less than the citizen in the context of the First Amendment. So, for example, if there is a restriction on base political speech, which you agree for a citizen would include support for a terrorist organization, even one that's credibly accused of being a terrorist organization, you have to explain why it's different for the non-citizen. And you have to explain it based on some principle or some basis of a distinction. You can't just say, well, the rights are different, right? Because if the argument, well, the rights are different worked, then it would go through for the Fourth Amendment context, right? If all you have to say is, well, the rights are different, but you don't apply it in the Fourth Amendment context. In the Fourth Amendment context, you say, you still need to get a warrant for that alien.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that I don't say that, and yet I do say that. We already said that in the context of the Second Amendment. Like we already said, the rights are different for temporary visitors. Hold on, temporary visitors and permanent aliens and citizens of the United States. We already articulated that there's a difference, and you're saying that I need to articulate why?
No,
I would.
No. You can't just say they're different.
No, please, ask.
You can't just say they're different, right? Because that's an excuse to say, well, the right means nothing at all. All it protects is, the right.
No. Hold on. I'm going to try to make this exactly analogous. So hopefully, even if you are going to pretend not to understand me or you disagree with me, then maybe your audience will. Okay.
Okay.
We understand that with the Second Amendment, at least as it's currently interpreted, is the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Okay. Now that looks different based off of different contexts. We've already had the Supreme Court, including Supreme Court justices who are conservative, say that does not mean tanks, nuclear bombs, and machine guns without a permit, right?
I haven't.
We've
heard
also
them,
had them.
I haven't heard them to say that, and I actually think we have
I
limited.
think Alito said it.
I think
I think Alito literally said that there was like a compelling public interest against certain weapons being held by members of the public.
Fair enough, but I know we have limited Second Amendment case law. It's fairly new. Just because Heller, was decided in 2008, 2009, and then McDonald afterwards, it's kind of a fairly novel area of constitutional law. So I don't know all the different intricacies.
But to get into the point, we already agree that, or not agree. I've already articulated that there's probably a reason why we give citizens the right to keep and bear arms, why we limit it for permanent green card holders, and why we deny it to temporary aliens.
Yeah, what is that?
And
reason?
the reason why I can already articulate this is the reason why is because somebody who is only here on a temporary basis does not have as much stake as somebody who lives here permanently and is subject to its laws in all of its forms. And therefore, somebody could just visit on a tourist visa, go buy a gun, shoot up a school or shoot up a public place, and therefore cause an extreme amount of damage with having very limited consequence. Maybe they would get killed, but let's face it, jihadists and other terrorists don't necessarily care about being killed. And so we've reasonably limited aliens being capable of bearing arms because we know that they could act against our interest.
Yeah, so
right? So what I would say, hold on, I'm going to analogize it to the first. With the first, we have already talked about how there's limits when it comes to promoting violence or taking part in violent actions. We've already talked about how starting a riot or starting a panic or something like that could be a reasonable grounds for arrest, despite the existence of the First Amendment, right? And then what you're effectively asking me is like, okay, the First Amendment, we understand these limitations when it comes to citizens. Why would you limit it to aliens and
in the context of
holders?
support? In the context of support for Hamas, and why would you treat them differently?
Well, and here's the exact same reason. It's almost directly analogous to my argument for the Second Amendment, is because there are people who are not interested in the future of the United States, and therefore they are coming here in order to disrupt the United States of America. And they're trying to have as much nefarious and delinquent effect upon the country as possible. And on top of that, you're shaking your head no, but that's literally articulated in 8 USC 1227. That's why they say the rights of non-citizens are limited. That's their exact argument.
So relax.
No, hold on. I need you to parse this apart. I need you to parse this apart.
Okay.
You can disagree with their rationale. I don't have a problem with you disagreeing with their rationale. You cannot say that their rationale does not exist.
So there are a lot of
rationale exists, and it's been articulated to you by the law, and it's been articulated to you by me.
So the rationale of treating non-citizens and citizens differently generally makes sense to me. And it's based on a lot of what you're saying. They have less of a stake in the country. Who knows where their loyalties are? Who knows if they are, used to our customs? There are a lot of bases, rational bases that are grounded both in law and history and tradition, to treat them differently. There's no doubt about that in my mind. I've never said that that's not the case. The question is, for a right that you agree that they do have, right? You agree they do have a right. So now we're outside of the context of situations in which the right is not at issue, situations in the normal due course of immigration matters that don't invoke the right. So, for example, deporting someone because
I don't know what you're cutting at. I kind of need you to cut at it.
So what I'm cutting at is when you've already agreed that there's a basis to give a right to a non-citizen. So here we're in a situation where we've given a right to a non-citizen, and we've given that right to the non-citizen. And so you can't just say, well, they don't have that right because we treat them differently because they're not, they're not as close connection to the country, or they're not as loyal to the country.
No, I mean, I can and I did.
We're already past the point of giving them this right that you agree that they have.
No, we're not.
Yes, we
Pisco,
are.
Let's not. Sorry, Literally, you're saying like, well, we already gave them the right, so we can't take it away now.
No. That you need to articulate a basis separate and apart from the general basis of, well, they're just not the same as citizens, to distinguish and justify a differential in a right that you say that they have, right? So I just did. But you're kind of grounding it out in a kind of circular, well, they're not as close to the country, they're not as connected to the country. And therefore might be interested in doing the country harm, and therefore the country has a compelling interest in separating out their rights and then subjecting them to deportation for certain kinds of behavior. So if I said the same thing about the Fourth Amendment and said, okay, they're the same reason, so we should be able to search them without a warrant, what would you say?
I would say that you would need to show like a compelling state interest in order to not be able to go through the warrant. Hold on. In order to finish the sentence, in order to not go through the warrants process. The warrants process is actually not difficult.
Whether it's difficult.
Let me finish this concept because I want your audience to understand it. The warrants process is not difficult. At 2 a.m. in Lake County, Florida, which is not exactly the most populous county on the planet, we were able to get warrants signed within 90 minutes. Okay? We could literally fill out a warrant on a laptop, ship the PDF to the state attorney's office. They had an on-duty judge, and the on-duty judge was capable, especially in exigent circumstances, of signing the warrant. We could get a warrant done in 90 minutes.
So who cares?
So if you are going to violate the Fourth Amendment, you need to articulate why that 90-minute process is burdensome on law enforcement to the extent that it needs to be separated between citizens and non-citizens.
I don't know if this is being dishonest. So we're not talking about burdening the right. We're saying, does the right even apply, right? So if
it relatively speaking applies.
No. So in the I just told you, right? You gave me a rationale for why, in the context of supporting a terrorist organization, it should be protected with respect to the citizen. But what you're saying is, it's not protected speech for non-citizens to support terrorist organizations. That's what you just said.
Yeah. I can differentiate. I think I see what you're cutting at.
So no, what I'm cutting at is the following. You gave me a rationale about, these people are more likely to be subversive, all that stuff. Everything you just said. Suppose that I said that with the Fourth Amendment. And I said the same exact thing, therefore they shouldn't need to get a warrant.
Yeah.
Explain
you would have to tell me why a warrant was inhibiting you from performing your duties.
Wait, no, I just told you, right? So the Fourth Amendment right against having
unreasonable searches and seizures without securing your property and effects.
It's just not the same with a non-citizen. They're not as likely to be loyal.
Why?
They're more for the same.
I've already told you why.
For the exact same reasons that you've said for the First Amendment context. Everything you said about the First Amendment and with respect to citizens supporting Hamas, I now apply to the Fourth Amendment context.
Okay, so I don't, in my opinion, you haven't sufficiently established why a warrants process is burdensome upon you.
Wait a second.
Whereas I can easily, hold on, you're acting like I'm crazy, but I can easily articulate how having non-citizens in your country articulating support for terrorist organizations is burdensome upon the country.
It's burdensome.
And then hold on.
I'll tell you why.
This is the other thing. You're saying that when it comes to political speech, this is the number one thing that the First Amendment was given for. The right to basically have freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, right to protest, all that kind of stuff, right? I'm going to go ahead and delineate this for you. I draw a firm line on terrorism, okay? So if you say free Palestine, I don't give a fuck. If you say that Israel is massacring Gazans in the tens of thousands, go off, king or queen or non-binary, whatever the fuck you are. I don't give a shit. What I do give a shit about is you throwing your weight behind an institution that massacres civilians as a part of their actual natural operations. That's the differentiation. So same thing with free Tibet, same thing with free this, free that, all that international bullshit. The second that you start supporting effectively a criminal organization that massacres civilians, yes, that is morally, rhetorically, and politically different, and therefore not deserving of protection. 100%. Easy.
So here we have a situation where I could say it's so burdensome for our police officers to need to get probable cause and a warrant. Forget the warrant process, right? The fact that they need to get probable cause to search aliens' homes. We know aliens are more likely to be subversive. We know aliens are more likely to be affiliated, and allied with other countries. We know aliens are more likely to not have our values and to be more dangerous than citizens. First of all, I query that whether the empirics are true on that, but I could say all the same things. And so we shouldn't have to get probable cause for searches of aliens' home.
Okay, I disagree.
But
too broad.
Wait a second. So that's
Judge Connor has ruled too broad.
That's the exact same rationale that you give.
No,
yes, it is. It absolutely is.
No, it's not.
It's the exact same rationale that you give for. You
can articulate how, but I completely disagree with you.
For the First Amendment, you say, well, they're not as likely. They're more likely to be affiliated with other countries. They're more likely to be subversive. They're not as loyal to the country.
Therefore, you cannot publicly articulate your endorsement of terrorist organizations. That's a reasonable limit.
Therefore, you cannot expect for your home to have the same protections as U.S. citizens, and why? And so we don't need to get probable cause to
We already talked about how different visas that might actually apply.
Oh no! Let's take the green card situation.
The question is
the green card situation.
This is the thing. It's reasonableness, and you're acting like I'm being unreasonable on one thing, and then when applied to a different scenario, somehow it all falls apart. But it doesn't. So it doesn't. It doesn't fall apart at all.
I think it absolutely.
It's logically coherent.
I think it absolutely falls apart. So in the case of one,
why?
In the case of one, right? Call it the Fourth Amendment, right? We have a rationale that arguably is more linked to whether or not you're a danger to the country, right? The right to search something, to wiretap you. This is the kind of stuff that actually tests whether or not you are in fact an agent, right? Someone can say something and not actually be an agent. Someone can express loyalties to another country and just be lying about it. But with respect to like searches, right? This is how the government actually finds out the juicy details and the actual connections.
Yeah, so let me articulate reasonability.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's say that you are a Saudi Arabian citizen. You're coming from an area that has a lot of terrorism. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're applying for a temporary visa to the United.
Do the green card example. Don't be a little bitch. Don't be a bitch. Do the green card example. Stop trying to do it on the temporary visas, on applications. Do the green card example.
I won't.
Don't be a fucking bitch.
No, I won't. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because we can go ahead and differentiate these scenarios, can't we?
No,
Pisco.
Don't be a bitch.
We can use our reasoning in order to differentiate.
Everyone can see what you're doing.
No, we'll go to the green card.
Everyone can see what you're doing. Just do the green card. Just do the green card.
No.
Take the harder case for your position.
Nope, I'm going to walk you. No, I listen to you for minutes at a time. You're going to listen to me for minutes at a time.
You're such a weasel.
No, I'm not.
You
I'm
are.
literally not. I'm literally here, and I've been talking to you for...
comparison.
Pisco. The insult weasel implies that I'm trying to avoid your arguments, which I'm not. I've been listening to you for 2 hours. If you want to get some MAGA dipshit chud who won't contend with what you're saying and they dodge everything you're saying, then you can use the weasel insult. You can't use it with me. I talk to you. I don't block you. I talk to you whenever the you want. So don't use the weasel
unless you're hanging out with
me.
your family.
Anyways,
and then you want to hang out with your family.
Yeah, because I love my family. Unlike most conservatives, I actually like and love my family.
It's a joke. You just do your little thing, then get to the green card.
Sure. No, I'm not skipping ahead. I'm going to do it.
Okay.
So with a tourist, if a individual was coming to the country and they were male, military age male, then maybe they need additional scrutiny, right? However, it's a family with wife, mother, 5 kids and Disney tickets bought. No, they don't need additional scrutiny, right? And so therefore, I would say that the state has a compelling interest to articulate why they would believe this person to be a danger. And if they can't articulate it, then they don't need to violate these person's Fourth Amendment rights, right? Then when we get to the green card holder, you and I already agreed that there might be classes of permanent residents who actually deserve to have their Fourth Amendment rights.
There could be classes of
violated.
citizens.
Didn't we already discuss
we said that of citizens.
We said that we already discussed how certain employed people within sensitive parts of the government waive their Fourth Amendment rights as a part of their capacity within the United States of America.
We said that of citizens.
And I already agreed to that earlier.
We said that of citizens.
And we also said that of aliens as well, didn't we?
So it doesn't distinguish.
It does distinguish because you could make it even more sensitive for aliens because with aliens, there's a greater risk.
Okay, so it's overdetermined with respect to aliens if you want to. But here we're talking about a situation in which no such neutral, extenuating circumstances exist. And I'm giving you an on-point example. An on-point example being that the Fourth Amendment is arguably more related to the security interests of a country. That is to say, just your expressed belief is not...
And by the way, I don't even know what you're arguing anymore because I've already said that there are like half a dozen to a dozen reasons in which you could either not violate, but you could curtail the rights and privileges under the Fourth Amendment. We already said that. So what the fuck are you arguing?
That's true of citizens. What you need to explain is the situation in which aliens are treated worse. You can't just say, you can't appeal to the fact that citizens...
Yes, I can. I 100% can. You keep saying that I can't do things, and then I can just do it. I can just say you can't appeal to that the fact that China steals a bunch of our IP, and therefore they wouldn't have Fourth Amendment protections. And I can say that if a Chinese person is coming to our state in order to work on sensitive security shit, then maybe they would get less protections than the people who work in sensitive shit that are citizens. Maybe they would be subject to more searches, and I would find that legally justifiable and reasonable.
I'm trying to get through.
You can't say that I can't point to it. I just did.
No, so I have given you an example, right? I've given you an example in which there's a right with many different categorical exceptions. in the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment. We agree. The Fourth Amendment exceptions, hot pursuit, plain sight, exigent circumstances, this will apply to...
I don't understand how this is going to help your argument, but continue.
So you pointing to a categorical exception or an exception maybe that has, like, I don't know, a slightly higher interest with respect to an alien, but it already exists for a citizen, that maybe there's a more exigent circumstance when it's an alien. I don't really see that logic, but go ahead. It doesn't help you because those categorical exceptions apply as to citizens and non-citizens. And so just saying that,
I don't agree.
It would be like saying, all right, well,
I've already articulated
the First Amendment doesn't protect child pornography, but that's true of U.S. citizens and it's true of aliens. And so you pointing to a categorical exception to the First Amendment or to the Fourth Amendment doesn't help justify the difference in treatment between a U.S. citizen and lawful permanent resident. In that,
I feel like you're ignoring what I'm saying. So I already articulated that with the Second Amendment. I already articulated how you treat different classes of people separately. I've also articulated with the Fourth Amendment, and I've talked about how you could treat different classes of people separately. And then you said, well, your motivation for treating citizens a certain way is the same motivation that you're treating aliens with. And I'm saying you could enhance the levels with which you violate or limit the Fourth Amendment protections exclusively based off of their immigrant status. So you're saying that I haven't said these things? I've said these things repeatedly.
Yeah, but this...
I've said them repeatedly. Are you hearing me say them?
Yeah, but the thing is, when you say, well...
You disagree.
When you say, well, that exception exists, but it applies with more... with more urgency with respect to aliens. I don't know whether I agree with that, actually, because I actually, with respect to like crime, for example, I think that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than U.S. citizens. So
okay, the entire legal system of the United States disagrees with you.
No, wait, the legal system doesn't have a say on who's more likely to commit crime, right?
No, it doesn't. But it says that the state has a compelling interest in preventing enemies of the United States from getting into the United States and causing harm to society.
Stop zooming out. So I agree.
I'm not zooming out.
Yes,
dude,
you are.
Pisco, you accuse me of zooming out, and then you say something is like, I don't even know if I agree with the fact that aliens might be a greater threat to the United States of America than domestic citizens. And then I say, that's literally what the statute says as the justification for the existence of the statute. And then you're like, yeah, well, you're just blowing up the conversation. It's like, no, I'm not. That's an exact rebuttal of what you're stating.
What I'm saying is a side point which is like, I actually don't know if the empirics go through on the notion that, non-citizens are more of a danger with respect to the Fourth Amendment.
Oh yeah, well, we've only had like one jihadist attack on United States soil, so we should just give up our security apparatus.
I don't know what that means. What are you saying? How is that relevant to anything?
What that means is you trying to figure out the classes of people and who's more dangerous doesn't prevent the law from standing on its own merits. Just because domestic citizens might be more dangerous than foreign nationals doesn't mean that you stop protecting against foreign nationals who might have a converse interest with the United States of America. You know this. You're just being obtuse.
You're justifying your difference in how you treat U.S. citizens and green card holders on the basis of their expressed avowal for terrorist organizations based on something empirical.
Correct.
Based on something empirical. You're saying, well, green card holders are more likely to do X.
I'm saying through virtue of being from the Middle East and North Africa, they are more likely to be sympathetic towards terrorist organizations, and terrorist organizations is an antisocial harm that could hurt the United States of America, and therefore having a code of conduct for immigrants that they can't endorse terrorist organizations is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
But it's not a reasonable thing to subject them to greater degrees of actual searches?
I already said that they should be subjected to higher degrees of searches depending on their categorization of their visit to the United States of America. I've already said it 7 times. You're acting like you're not hearing me.
For the green card holder. For the green card holder. For the green card holder. If for someone who's here on a green card, should they have...
Depends on why they're here.
They're lawful permanent residents. That's all information I'm giving you. They're unemployed lawful permanent residents.
Unemployed? Well, they should be kicked out just for that. Hold up. Let me see if I can get to the steel man of what you're asking, because the perspective of what you're asking is actually kind of absurd to me. So let me see if I can steel man.
I think you understand it.
I'm not sure I do. So the green card is a lawful permanent resident. That's a category of person that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay. I already talked about how the Second Amendment is limited for them. You don't care about that. You're asking why the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment should be
You're not following.
Should be specifically limited for green card holders, but not for citizens.
Let me restate it because you're not understanding it, right? So you have said that the restriction that you're trying to impose on First Amendment's support for terrorism is based in part on, or in large part, based on the fact that they're more likely to have a close connection and be a security risk because of their inherent, the fact that they come from these far off lands that are inherently closer and, closer to a nucleus of Islamism. I would argue well, I would actually say it to you, it is also true in the Fourth Amendment context. And so you just said, right, they're more likely to, because of their inherent closeness to those regions, to be security threats based on their, therefore the First Amendment, is going to be different with respect to their avowals for terrorism. Why isn't that also the case for a green card holder with respect to the government not having to go get probable cause or a warrant to search their home? They're more likely to be a threat. They're more likely to be close connected to Saudi Arabia. They're more likely to be, connected to terrorism.
Because I don't. This isn't a difference in principle. This is a difference in process. And I've already said it, so I don't understand how you're not understanding it. So, as a matter of fact, how about let's see if we can pull up some clarity by just looking at the Fourth Amendment. Okay. So, why am I typing in Google? Fourth Amendment.
The right of the people to be secure in their houses, papers, persons, and effects. I used to have it memorized.
I got it. Yeah. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath and affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
Yep.
So the whole point of the Fourth Amendment is to protect against unreasonable.
Yeah.
Well, so if you want to make an argument that actually all aliens are enemies of the United States and they should be subject to unreasonable searches at all times, you can make that argument. That's not an argument that I'm going to make.
So the scope of the scope of the Fourth Amendment right is what's at issue here. To whom it applies and when and in what contexts. Just like the First Amendment, right? We're talking about the scope of the right, not whether you can violate the right. You can never violate the First Amendment. You can never violate the Fourth Amendment. When we talk about whether the right protects something or doesn't.
Violate is an interesting term. You can absolutely limit it. And you can also, I don't know if violate is the right term. So for instance, just conceptually explain this to me. I have a First Amendment right. Congress can make no law abridging my freedom of speech. Right? But I say, Pisco, you and I are in a bar, so you have reasonable belief that I could carry out a threat. And I say, Pisco, you're being so fucking annoying right now, I'm going to slap you in the mouth. That's illegal. And then you call law enforcement and you say, Connor threatened to slap me. I was put in reasonable fear that he was actually going to do it. He committed assault against me. What do you call me being arrested for assault? Yeah. Because obviously it's abridging my freedom of speech.
You would say that law does not abridge the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech does not include such and such activity, right? The freedom of speech does not include child pornography. The freedom of speech does not include obscenity. The freedom of speech does not include fighting words, okay? So when we speak about these rights, it is never legal to violate someone's right. We're just talking about the scope of the right? Whether or not the right actually extends as far as a certain category of thing. So in the case of
I feel like you've used more words to describe the concept I'm pointing at, and you know the concept that I'm pointing at.
I'm trying to have conceptual clarity here to suggest we're not talking about curtailing rights in the sense of violating the right. We're talking about to what extent does it cover certain people in certain contexts, and to what extent does it cover not cover those individuals in those contexts. So in the context of the Fourth Amendment, it protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But by definition, right, a search that's pursuant to probable cause and exigent circumstances is reasonable. Okay. So you don't need a warrant there, right? If you consent to a search, you don't need probable cause or a warrant, right? If someone consents to a search, you don't need to get a warrant, and you don't need to have probable cause. They just agree, like let's say you're a cop, right, Connor? I invite you into my home and say, search it, Mr. Officer. You don't need probable cause. You need a warrant.
I know where I'm going to go argumentatively.
Well, let me go where I want to go. Let me
go. You go where you want to go.
All right. So if let me make the argument, right? Not that it's unreasonable to have a search and seizure a warrantless or probable cause-less search of a resident alien. Not that it's unreasonable, but that it's another categorical exception to the Fourth Amendment, just like a consent search. So the argument isn't that we're going to do something unreasonable. The argument is the right doesn't extend, just like in your First Amendment example, as far as to protect green card holders in any search of their property for any reason or no reason.
Yeah. So let's say that we have green card holders, we have lawful permanent residents who consistently do suicide bombings. Okay, they just walk into Christmas markets, they walk into random places, and they blow themselves up. And we decide as a country that actually the Fourth Amendment no longer applies to green card holders because there is like a reasonable public interest in us being able to search their papers and effects because our security administration is no longer capable of dealing. I'm not done yet.
Yeah.
Of dealing with the threat of bombing. It has become a blight on our society. Tens of thousands of people are dying per year.
Yeah. Let me give you what you want.
I wouldn't have a problem with them limiting that right and saying that aliens are subject to immediate search for security purposes.
Would you say that of black people?
No.
Yes,
they're
right?
citizens.
Wait, no. Hang on. If it were really the case,
there's a categorical difference.
Wait. If it were really the case,
I'm letting the dogs out. I'm still listening.
Whoa! All right. If it were really the case,
I'm right here.
Yeah. If it were really the case that black people or Jewish people or Muslims were representing the same kind of threat that you're saying that in your example, right? And the reason you're using that example, and this is a common tactic of Counterpoints, is to use these examples where there is a highly compelling purpose, and that would be narrowly tailored, and where it's like an emergency COVID-like situation. But I'm happy to deal with that. I don't think it's problematic at all. I'm happy to deal with it and to show you why it doesn't help you. So that would justify those conditions, restrictions on the basis of race. That would justify restrictions on the basis of religion, right? If it were actually true that 99% of Muslims in this country were engaged in a kind of permanent jihad against the, notwithstanding the fact that we have protection of religion in this country, you would meet the rigorous standards of the tiers of scrutiny analysis that I've just laid out to have, immediate searches whenever you want of any Muslim or immediate detention of any Muslim. So even though it's a really, really high test in the conditions that you've just explained, it would meet those tests, even in cases where it seems appalling, right? That you would have, searches based on race. Yes, there are some factual circumstances that constitutionally you would be able to do this. What I'm talking about is not that example. What I'm talking about is in current day, under current conditions, is it possible that green card holders could be subjected to random searches without probable cause or a warrant in their homes? On the basis
and I say no because it's unreasonable, and then I say that deporting people for advocating for terrorism.
Why is it unreasonable?
Actually, this is where my argument was going to go. This is where my argument is going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and argue it. Freedom of speech and freedom of conscience is a very broad right. Okay, so it can manifest itself in expressing of art, in expression of religious beliefs, in public speech, in political advocacy, in social advocacy. It's one of the most broad things we can do because it's literally articulating what's inside your brain, okay? And so what the government has said and what I have said is that terrorism, which necessarily by definition is the wholesale slaughter of civilians for political ends, along with kidnapping, assassination, murder, all those beautiful things that you read earlier, is a antisocial behavior that rips apart the social fabric of the United States. And so if there is an alien who participates in this behavior or supports it rhetorically, then they will be deported. They can talk about Lady Gaga, they can talk about free Palestine, they can talk about free Tibet, they can talk about their favorite movie, they can talk about all that shit till the fucking cows come home. The one thing they can't do is advocate for the mass slaughter of civilians.
What about racism?
And that is a reasonable limit to the right.
Can you deport a green card holder based on racism against black people?
Can you or should you?
Under the First Amendment, can you?
I have no idea. I would say that if the State Department wanted to create some rule where it was like, the ethno-religious, racial, heritage of America is part of its strongest attribute. Therefore, anybody who's racist and a resident, anybody who's racist who's an alien gets deported. I don't think I would give a fuck at all.
What if they said, if you support, let's say, Israel?
Again, I wouldn't care. Yeah, I literally wouldn't care. If we inverted the scenarios and they said that support for the IDF specifically, I wouldn't say the entire state of Israel, the same way that I wouldn't say the entire state of Palestine. But if you wanted to invert the scenario and say that support for the genocidal Israeli occupation forces of Gaza is grounds for deportation, I wouldn't give a fuck at all.
So if Trump started deporting people who supported the IDF and said that you support...
Wouldn't care. I wouldn't care at all. A nation has to be able to establish the quality of character of the people that it admits within its own borders. And if those determining factors are established by a court or by representatives and they're reasonable, I don't care.
So basically, the First Amendment, by your lights, with respect to green card holders, only protects their sandwich orders, whether or not they like Hamilton. But that's pretty much it. Because if the government decides, I mean, then they don't really... What kind of First Amendment right is that? What does it mean to say they have a First Amendment right if we can deport you on any basis except some kind of like ridiculous...
It's the right to live in a free and secure society. It's the right to express your opinion on... You're asking me what kind of right is that? I'm answering you. It's the right to live in a free and secure society. It's the right to express yourself when it comes to art or when it comes to almost any other venture besides politics. It is the right to... Dude, you can have a good life without endorsing terrorism. You're acting like endorsing terrorism is necessary for the fabric of the United States of America, and it's not.
We just exploded your basis of what you determine to be deportable is if the government determines IDF, if the government says basically any political allegiance, you can be deported.
Let me explain that. Let me explain that. So people argue... I'm not saying you're doing this specifically, but people argue that like, well, what if Donald Trump or what if another authoritarian inverts the support for Hamas into the support for the IDF? Would you still support it? And the whole point of that logical exercise isn't to actually talk about the principle or the right. The whole point of it is to see whether or not you can catch somebody in like a hypocrisy because you will politically support.
No, it's not that.
I'm not done.
It's not that.
I'm not done. Whether or not you will politically support one violent armed faction, but as soon as it comes to support of another violent armed faction, if your principles change. And mine don't.
Yes.
Okay?
So it's not to test whether or not you're hypocritical. It's to test how workable your principle is. So basically, you've just acknowledged that the government should be allowed, even under the First Amendment, to deport you for like any political belief.
As long as it's reasonable, appointed by a court. I'm getting tired, so we're getting sloppy.
I mean, like, any political belief, if they think it's detrimental to their society, they can deport you based on any political belief you hold.
Sure. Cool. Awesome. Great.
Okay.
Dude, great. Listen, here's the thing. We've talked about, I've gone over it probably half a dozen to a dozen times, and I'm pretty sure you did hear me, that we do put reasonable limits on the Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment, and that you do understand the fact that there are reasonable limits to the First Amendment. Then on top of that, talked about classes of people and categories of people and how these laws apply differently. We've already talked about how these classes and categories might lead to further violations of aliens than they would citizens. So we've already articulated like the logical basis for why this is a thing. And then on top of that, we're now kind of testing like the limits of my logic for it. But at the same time, this is my genuine held belief, okay? We are a republic of citizens who are trying to follow the due process of law, and we are trying to extend the maximum amount of liberty to human beings possible. If there are people who come to this country who threaten that order, then they do not need to be a part of this country. Being here as an alien is a privilege and not a right.
By whom?
It is a privilege and not a right.
That
it
order
is a
as defined by
privilege
whom?
and not a right.
Okay, so
and that is the basis of the argumentation.
When you say it's privilege, not a right, then you disagree with what you said at the beginning, right? When in the beginning I said there are certain First Amendment categories of First Amendment speech that would prohibit deportation, but what you're saying now is immigration is a category of its own, that immigration is different, and that anything with respect to immigration, the government can pretty much put any restriction on you and deport you based on anything because it's not really a First Amendment issue.
Yeah, but because I'm not retarded and I'm not actually, but because I'm not retarded and not actually a fascist, I'm not saying that those values should be arbitrary. So, for instance, if you remember earlier in this conversation, we talked about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Kilmar Abrego Garcia came to this country in 2011. He hasn't committed crimes in 14 years. He's a father who is gainfully employed, who has 3 children in our system. There are character witnesses out the ass who effectively, I'm not done yet, who effectively say that he is a decent human being and a credit to his community. And he was deported arbitrarily by the Trump administration for no basis that we can establish besides the fact that he was accused of being an MS-13 member for which there is no evidence.
You're virtue
signaling. I am not going to support that because it's unreasonable.
You're virtue signaling.
It's unreasonable.
It's not
unreasonable.
So with Kilmar, it's not a First Amendment issue. It's authoritarianism. I was
talking about due process because you're trying to say, hold on, you're trying to say that my grounds for deportation are arbitrary and therefore up to the whim of the executive administration, and it's not.
No, I said it's not. I said that you don't really believe in the First Amendment for resident aliens, because if you believe in the First Amendment, sure,
right.
Okay, all right.
You're right. I agree that it's a thing. I don't believe it principally.
Okay, but if it's a thing, and I also started.
Then I have to. Then when the Supreme Court reviews it, I have to abide.
Okay.
I have to abide by the ruling of the Supreme Court because I live in a representative republic.
Okay. Hey.
So basically, if the Supreme Court comes down and they say, Connor, you were right in this debate. There are reasonable limits to aliens. Therefore, these people can be deported. Then I'm going to be like sick. And then if they come down and if they say, no, actually Pisco's right, we care about the principle of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech way more than we care about the security of the United States. Therefore, this is not a compelling government interest, and we can have non-citizens advocate for terrorism on U.S. soil. Pisco is right. Then I'm going to say, I'm a member of a republic and I respect the rule of law. Therefore, even if I disagree with it, I'm going to abide by it.
The thing is, of course you're going to abide by it, but you would still disagree with it.
Of course.
Yeah, that's the thing, which is, what would it take to convince you otherwise? Would it be a legal argument?
I don't think you're going to be able to be honest. I can't think of a single rational reason for why I should have to tolerate people coming from another country and then telling me that the mass slaughter of civilians is a good thing, and I have to be like, oh yeah, I'll invite you over to the barbecue next week. Like, no, you go back to your shitty country.
You keep changing to admission decisions. You keep changing what we're talking about. But hey, I wouldn't
even care if he was a lawful permanent resident. Same thing stands.
Yeah, if he's had any political belief that the government disagreed with, you would be in favor of the government having the power. You may not agree with the application in the individual context, but you would agree the expression of any political belief would be a ground for a lawful ground for the government to exclude him or deport him. That's
potentially if it was antisocial or anti-governmental, yeah.
According to the government, right? And the government gets to decide that.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. And do you know what the government is made up of?
Representatives and the president.
It's made up of people. It's made up of my fellow citizens.
So the First Amendment is meant to apply in contradiction to what the general sentiment is. And so when you say that aliens do have First Amendment rights, you're being facetious. You're not actually being serious. Because if it were true, it wouldn't be like, okay, we'll just let the government decide. Because the whole point of the First Amendment is to say the government can't decide even if it wants to. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So it's kind of disingenuous for you to say they have First Amendment rights.
You already in this conversation have admitted that there's categories that don't apply. So for instance, oftentimes art is called like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, et cetera, but we already agreed that child pornography is not within that category.
Yeah, that applies to citizens. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that Mahmoud Khalil drew a mural, and in that mural, it's like Guernica, right? It's the version of Guernica, and it's expressing, sadness at the loss of the bombing in campaign in Gaza. But it is a political piece of art, right? He draws a political piece of art that is condemning the Israeli government's bombing campaign in Gaza.
Then that would be insufficient for me for deportation.
Why? Because it's visual
Why?
art?
Because I literally drew, and the United States government, we've already discussed it a billion times in this conversation, they already drew a hard line over advocacy for terrorism.
No, but you said before.
That's what we've been talking about for two fucking hours.
But we just made your principles broader than that. It's not just that. You said essentially any political belief is liable for the government to be able to deport you on that basis.
Yeah, but the government needs to be. I've already said this, and you're latching onto this for dear life because we went ahead and talked about all the details of all the principles for 2 hours. So in the last 20 minutes, you're saying like, oh, you think it's a privilege? That means that they can do whatever the fuck they want.
Well, you granted it. I didn't force you to grant it. You granted it.
Yeah, because I was tired and I was annoyed. But
oh wow,
no, it needs to be reasonable. Obviously, I don't believe in unreasonable searches and seizures. I don't believe in unreasonable limits to the First Amendment. Okay. I don't believe in unreasonable limits to the Second Amendment.
So what if the government
obviously
says,
this is with the caveat of rationality, which if you didn't think I was a moron, should be granted.
Wait a second. So if the government says this art piece is clearly lionizing Hamas, it's this version of Guernica that I'm describing, this example of Guernica of the Gaza bombing campaign, they say this is advocacy for terrorism. It's going to make more people support Hamas as opposed to the IDF. It's not in our national security interest, and so we're going to deport you because this piece of art is definitely causing a harm, and we don't. It's support for Hamas.
Then I would say it would be up to a judge if the version of Guernica or whatever. I'm going to answer your question. You asked one. So if the version of Guernica was explicitly the symbol of the Al-Qassam brigades.
No, don't change it.
Then I would be like,
don't fucking change the hypothetical, Connor. I notice you do.
I'm not changing shit.
I notice you're changing.
I'm literally saying you keep saying like, oh, you would support this unreasonable thing because you made a general statement 20 minutes ago. No. And I keep saying repeatedly, I say it's going to be based off of reason and rationality, basis of our entire system.
So
and you're like, no, I got you on this one time that you said Guernica, you think that residency is a privilege. Therefore,
I want to deport people for no reason
whatsoever.
I want an answer to the specific hypothetical, and I'll make it as clear as possible.
Sure.
It's a version of Guernica. The bombers are depicted as Nazis type people in terms of they're painted very negatively as bloodthirsty. But there's no symbols of Hamas.
Can I Google this? Can I see this?
Have you know Guernica? It's
the are you saying Virgin? VRGIN?
Virgin? I don't understand.
Yeah. What are you saying?
The version of Guernica, Guernica
version VERSION.
So the hypothetical Guernica. So Guernica is a picture by Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso's an artist.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. He's known for Cubismo. All right.
Right.
So he drew
this ugly. Yeah, I would deport them just for following Picasso.
Okay, this version of Guernica was criticizing the bombing campaign by, I believe, the Nazis in the Spanish Civil War. There was a bombing campaign during the Spanish Civil War. And
I'm still listening. My dog's whining again.
I'm giving you an example in which a resident alien draws a version of Guernica, and in that version of Guernica, it's a cubism, right? It's not meant to be real to life, but
it's potentially anti-Semitic. Okay, gotcha.
No, stop. So it's basically condemning the bombing of Gaza, and it's basically condemning the IDF. There's no explicit imagery supporting Hamas, but the government says this is implicitly supporting Hamas, and we see this as subversive and as harming our foreign policy interests, and we don't have to accept these resident aliens. When they come here, they agree to play by the rules. And by drawing this version of Guernica that is depicting the Gaza bombing campaign, you are actually undermining and advocating and expressing support for Hamas. They make that interpretation, they make that interpretive leap. And in that circumstance,
then I think they have to make that interpretive leap in front of a judge, and then the judge needs to decide whether or not that's reasonable.
What would you say? Do you think that's a reasonable basis to?
Oh no, I think that's bad. Yeah, I think that's terrible. I think that's an abuse. Why?
Yeah.
Because so hold on, you're gonna have to listen. Okay. freedom of conscience and freedom of speech are universal human goods. Okay? So that value, that principle, the First Amendment, it's good here, it's good in Iran, it's good in China, it's good all over the planet. It's probably even good on Mars. Okay? Universal human good. Universal sapient good. If you are a creature who is capable of intelligence, being able to express yourself without fear of violence as long as it's reasonable is a universal good. However, we exist in a geopolitical landscapes in which there are tribal factions that advocate for different political tribes. And some of those political tribes are nefarious and wish to enslave the entire planet. And so fascists, authoritarian communists, and theocratic Islamists use the freedom of conscience and freedom of speech of the United States and free societies in order to subvert and destroy those societies. And the truth is, a lot of them are really, really, really good propagandists. So just because you have a universal human good doesn't mean that you invite your enemies into your table at all times so they can take advantage of your goodwill in order to subvert and destroy your society. These values, the liberals can pretend that they're contradictory. They are not.
What the f did you think I asked?
Contradictory
what the f did you think I asked? Why are you lecturing me?
Well, because you're asking me how can I simultaneously want to deport people for using their freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and then I'm saying that freedom of speech and freedom of expression is a universal human good, and so the liberal straw man is, well, why isn't it good for the person advocating for terrorism in your household? And I explained why.
What do you think I asked? You don't have no clue. You just rambled to filibuster. That was pathetic.
You can ask your question. And also, it's not pathetic. It's literally the principles underlying the entire conversation, Pisco. You dipshit. Don't act like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about with freedom.
You're like oh, wait. You're cutting out. I can't hear you anymore. You must have pulled your mic. No one can hear you. You're so angry. You must have pulled your mic. We can't hear you anymore. Check your mic. Yeah, you did. Yeah. Listen to the question next time, dipshit. No, not right now. You're saying you have to go? I can't read lips, dude.
Hello?
Yeah, now you're good. You don't even remember what I asked, dude. And this is the thing, right?
Oh, hold on. I called you a piece of shit, and I'm going to do it again. You don't even know what I asked, bro. How about this? How about we were talking about freedom of speech and freedom of conscience as a principle applied by law for the past 2 hours? So for you to pretend to be obtuse right now is absurd. You're way more intelligent than that. So don't give me I don't even know what you're talking about, bro. I just gave you an exact summary of freedom of speech and freedom of conscience versus the requirements in order to safeguard a society, which is the fundamental underlying point of all of this legislative bullshit. So don't act like you don't know what the I'm talking about. You clearly do, you obtuse, self-aggrandizing, self-righteous dipshit.
Dude.
Okay?
Dude.
But go ahead and ask the question again.
So I gave you an example, a very stylized and detailed example about a painting, and you completely dodged that because you're desperately trying to find a way because you don't want to deport the painter.
I'm trying to desperately go eat a sandwich in a minute.
You desperately don't want to deport the painter.
Ask the question again.
Yes. So
ask the question again.
But I need to explain what happened, right? You don't want to deport the painter. You don't want to deport the painter because that seems just weird and icky to you. But I'm giving you an example in which the person makes I'm also tired.
Now you're tired. Now you're f***ing up. Oh, you're dodging the question by f***ing up your words, Pisco.
No,
you must be trying to dodge what I'm trying to say.
Stop.
You're a bad faith interlocutor. You're a weasel.
Stop. No. I gave you a very specific example of a painting where it was kind of condemning Israel, but it was just in a kind of piece of art. And the government says essentially the same thing that it's saying about Mahmoud Khalil here, and the same First Amendment argument you're making. And I asked, would that be
switching back to the mic that failed, but it should still work. So,
okay. No.
That's fine. I'll go back to the other one. Yep.
Yeah. So stop trying to use your Mike tactics on me. I'm not going to forget my question.
I'm not. Yeah. I'm gonna go get a pizza in a second.
Yeah. Okay.
You were saying.
So you desperately don't want to grant the painter example, where someone is expressing their anger, frustration, outrage via the painting of this version of Guernica. Do you think that is a basis to deport him if the government says, hey, this is implicit support for Hamas. We don't have to accept you on the same term as a U.S. citizen. We don't have to handle this, and so you're gone.
I think they can. I think it's bad if they do.
So you think it's bad if they do here with Khalil?
No, I don't.
Explain why you would feel differently about Khalil versus the.
I explained to you for I explained for you for 2 hours.
Okay.
So I think I'm wrapped.
Hey, good convo, bro.
It's good memes. Listen, I'm getting like.
You cut out again. You did something. Are you like hitting yourself with that thing? Are those your miniatures?
Hello?
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, it's my fucking dog. He likes to lie on my.
Yeah. My dog ate my homework. We've all heard it.
Yeah, hold on. Let me see if NVIDIA is working. So, anyways, sorry. Do your summary and outro, and I'll do my.
So I think it's clear that the First Amendment does apply to non-citizens. If you take Connor's invitation to the destruction of rights, that this kind of loose and generic fear of non-citizens would justify, I think, encroachments on all sorts of rights, and I would even argue that the rights related to unreasonable searches and seizures are more at issue when we're talking about security rationales, when we're talking about loyalty, and yet there seems to be this kind of intuitive ickiness about subjecting green card holders to searches without probable cause or without a warrant. Now you can try to explode those principles into admission decisions when you're literally applying for something, when you're at the border, where even U.S. citizens don't have these rights, but again, it doesn't help you in the context of someone who's established in the country, and where the right is supposed to apply at its maximum. The First Amendment is supposed to apply at its maximum to political speech, but it seems it's given short thrift in Connor's version of the right, which he admits that green card holders are supposed to have, that it only protects these kind of like not important things, like your opinions on art or your opinions, what you say with respect to a sandwich, and that he's going to grant maximum, whether or not he agrees with the ultimate exercise of discretion by the government with respect to a political belief. He still believes in the right of the government to use their deportation power basically to undermine or deport on the basis of any political belief, as long as there can be some kind of plausible nexus to something he doesn't like, whether that's racism, whether that's sexism, whether that's any kind of political belief. And it's just so easy to see why this is not in the conception of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is more than just an individual right. It's a declaration that these kinds of decisions of making preferences based on ideology actually should not be, by and large, in the hands of the government. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It's acknowledging that we don't want the government to make these kinds of, yes, very important civilization-dependent questions, that those need to be, aired out in the marketplace of free ideas. And so I think that is a right that applies while you're in the United States. And maybe there's some distinctions that if you're at the border, like applying for admission and where, you don't have much of any rights, or at least much, much, much fewer rights. And I can even think of certain situations in which you would have fewer First Amendment rights as a green card holder. But I can't imagine anything approximating a First Amendment right that would exist for green card holders that wouldn't protect your political support for a foreign organization any more than a U.S. citizen's. And even as applied here, that's just the First Amendment argument. We still have the statutory argument, which the government isn't even arguing what Connor is arguing, and so it should be dismissed on that basis alone. And furthermore, even under Connor's argument, I don't think it goes through on a statutory basis. And even if there were a statutory argument, I don't think that you can attribute the statements and actions of this group to Mahmoud Khalil. And so I think this is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And even if you think Mahmoud Khalil should be deported, surely the people who are not affiliated with the Columbia protests and who just express support for Palestine, who are being intruded upon by this government, they are not subject to the same interest. And so at the very least, Connor should be condemning the Trump administration for most of what it's doing in this space of trying to allegedly protect Jews from anti-Semitism, when it's doing nothing of the sort. And really what it's doing is it's promoting a backlash against Israel. And you're seeing the polling numbers that, Israel has never seen such lack of support in this country, especially among young people who don't trust the government to be doing this kind of thing. One of the reasons why we have the First Amendment is not just because it's smart and it prevents against tyranny, but people don't trust the government to come to these determinations by itself. And when you're just told the answer by the government, what you should believe, there's going to be a backlash. And that's what you're seeing right now, in addition to the substantive conduct that's happening on the ground in Gaza. But thank you so much for the opportunity to have that conversation. Connor, I'll give you the last word.
All right, thank you kindly. So I've articulated all of my disagreements in the earlier segments of it. We already talked about the limits to the Second Amendment rights for visitors, green card holders, and citizens. We also talked about the hypothetical scenarios in which the Fourth Amendment would be limited. So I don't see why the First Amendment is somehow exempt to any kind of limitations that the Second and Fourth wouldn't also be potentially subject to. We also talked about the fact that this isn't just me making shit up. This is also the way that some courts are interpreting this stuff, and they're using existing laws in order to do so. So liberals and progressives can maybe in their minds argue that the First Amendment is absolute, except for when it isn't. But I don't agree. And I also think that there are reasonable classifications of people, including visitors and aliens, that should be separate and separate for obvious reasons. This isn't just my opinion. This is also the opinion of like 8 USC 1227. This is also the opinion of like 8 USC, I forget if it's like 1182 or something like that, but it's deportable and inadmissible aliens. So go check out those statutes if you feel like it. I do appreciate the spirited conversation. But at the same time, what I will say, the way that, you got little brother syndrome, the way that you get under my skin is you're like, you're weaseling, you're dodging, you're exploding. Listen, Pisco, we can talk about whatever the you want to talk about. I'll talk to you about like microbes on Mars and whether or not they're like asexual or sexual. We can talk about that for 30 fucking minutes. I don't give a shit. But I'm not dodging what you're saying. I'm addressing it directly. I feel like sometimes I say things that are true, but you're being obtuse because you disagree. It's not because you don't understand what I'm saying. It's because you disagree with what I'm saying. And so you pretend what I'm saying is actually nonsensical when it's perfectly logical. You just don't like it. So anyways, parasocial love to you and yours. If you guys want to catch me five hours a day, 5 days a week, you can do so, number one, on my Counterpoints channel, my political channel, or you can do so on Valor Media Network, VALOR. And I'll be live 25 hours a week, Monday through Friday, noon to 5.
Follow Counterpoints. Definitely do this. It'll be fun. And we always get into, like, this is not new for us to yell at each other. Also follow.
We're like an old married couple.
Yeah. But, okay, go with God. And
vaya con Dios.
And best to you and yours.
You too.
Later, bro.
Bye, buddy.
Bye. Oh my God, that was insane. I haven't thought about that Fourth Amendment argument just then, so I really appreciate this conversation because I didn't really. For people who stress like the security rationale, the Fourth Amendment argument is almost stronger to like deprive green card holders of that. If what you're saying is they're less loyal. And that's all you're saying, right? They're just different. I think it really helped me crystallize. I'm going to include that in my article about it and the argument article. And so that was really helpful, right? Because if you're saying that, we're going to treat the support for a terrorist organization differently and allow it for U.S. citizens, but not allow it for green card holders, that the difference there is because, green card holders are more likely to be security threats. It just doesn't make sense, intuitive sense to me why they're more likely to be security threats in the abstract, empirically. But even if it were true, then that's just as true for like the security rationale of searches and seizures. Probably more true in terms of why a government might like want to search you or wiretap you or go into your house, right? But everyone feels icky with the government being allowed to search green card holders' homes without probable cause or without a search warrant. So I think it's a very strong argument that I hadn't considered until he brought it up. I brought it up in the Tim Pool one, but I didn't really push on it. I've been pushing more on the religion argument, and I actually don't know if it's the most effective one. I'll still include every single one of those arguments in that article that's coming, and the articles are coming, folks. But people just intuitively just think that the religion stuff is different. I think it does help me ground myself and explain it to people, especially people who are lawyers. But the Fourth Amendment one, I think, is pretty strong. What is the difference between limiting the scope of the First Amendment and making a law restricting your right to the First Amendment? Aren't you both limiting? No. So right. So you should think of if the court is considering a First Amendment issue, they're not violating the First Amendment. I guess you could say you're restricting the First Amendment, but what you're doing is you're defining what the First Amendment protects and what it doesn't protect, right? You can't violate the First Amendment legally. The First Amendment can't be it's part of the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land. You have to follow what the law is. But you're defining what the law is, right? You're saying, does the First Amendment cover X and not that? So you shouldn't think about it in terms of... so the reason I brought this up is because Connor says, it shouldn't be unreasonable. You shouldn't do unreasonable searches, obviously. And that's a way for him to try to dodge the Fourth Amendment point. But you can't let that happen. You just have to say, no, it wouldn't be unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. It would just be a categorical exception to the Fourth Amendment such as that exists for like the vehicle exception, the consent exception. It would just be like the green card holder exception. That's an analytical nuance that matters in like some circumstances. I think it mattered there because no one wants to say, because you could very easily say, well, obviously I don't want the Fourth Amendment to be, I don't want unreasonable searches of green card holders. Of course that would be per se unreasonable, but the argument would be we're just defining what is reasonable and what's not reasonable. And so by taking a step back and realizing that what we're doing here is defining the scope of the right as opposed to when it's okay to violate the right, you're able to get that clarity that you can be like, no. We're not trying to do unreasonable anything. We're trying to define what is reasonable, when is it reasonable, and what is not reasonable. So that's why I brought that up, and that's why I think it matters. I hope that makes sense. Niels Forsman says, and against unreasonable by the direct words, open the space directly versus no law. Yeah, I think that's another great point. Oh, did everyone see that? That's just a really great point that I didn't even think of. This is why, you guys are really smart. This is a great point from Niels. So this is why the Fourth Amendment is more apt for the kind of security connection argument from Connor. It says Congress shall make no law, which seems to imply a more categorical restriction, as opposed to against unreasonable searches being less kind of categorical, less explicit language, more like weak language, more loosey-goosey language. So I think that's a really good point. Even under that framework, he's admitting to giving powers to government he doesn't support. And he's kind of, when you admit to like, yeah, I guess you could do it for any political belief, you're just kind of lost. I mean, like, then what does the First Amendment mean, right? And you get into the situation where you start by giving them a kind of an absurdly low intensity First Amendment opinion, right? I enjoy Hamilton. Clearly protected speech on the First Amendment. And they're like, of course you couldn't deport someone because they like Hamilton. And they say that because they think that's an easy thing to grant and that they're granting like some, but really, right? What they're granting, if they're going to buy the argument that the First Amendment doesn't protect support for Hamas, what they're buying there is, oh, it would support me in my least provocative, least political opinions. But that kind of is the opposite of what we would expect. We would expect the First Amendment to be most important for unpopular speech, for divisive speech, for political speech. That's what it's meant to protect, right? If the First Amendment were designed to protect things that people agreed to or things that didn't excite the passions, we wouldn't need it. And so there's an inherent tension there that they would grant that because they just really what's driving them is they don't like the speech. They don't like what Mahmoud Khalil was standing for. They don't like the protesters. That's what's driving things, not any kind of like real substantive embrace of First Amendment principles that they're applying neutrally. If that were what's going on there, then they would see the tension in allowing for these kinds of opinions of, your favorite sandwich, whatever, but not allowing divisive speech that's likely to make people upset. You can also make the kind of pragmatic argument that this isn't helping anything, right? Shutting down this speech is not going to be effective in preserving support for Israel, if that's what the goal. Nor should that be the domain of the government to impose government restrictions on the basis of like who they think in order to make people agree with them. The government, of course, can speak and try to convince people, but the government can't push people using sticks to agree with its view. That's for the people to decide.